Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the February 2nd, 2016 meeting of the Los Gatos Town Council. Please silence your devices, and Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Marcia Jensen.
Here.
Councilmember Rob Rennie.
Here.
Councilmember Steve Leonardis.
Here.
Vice Mayor Mariko Sayak.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Barbara Spector.
Here. Each meeting, we ask someone from a student to join us up here for the Pledge of Allegiance, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And this evening, I would like Stella Farwell to please come up here with me. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Stella. She's a third grader at St. Mary's School. Now, this part is really cool. She's a sixth-generation Los Gatan. She's a descendant of John W. Linden, who I know was an early mayor, council member, and in fact, he was a council member in the year that Los Gatos was incorporated. Now, she not only has a wonderful history, she's wonderful in her own regard. Her favorite activities are reading and art and sewing and tennis and tap dancing and ballet and doing homework with her dad. I don't know about that one. What do you do with your mom? Help her cook dinner. Okay. So if you will all stand and join us for the salute to the flag.
Right hand over your heart, ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank her and a round of applause. Thank you, Stella. She deserves another round of applause. Mr. Town Attorney, do we have a closed session report?
There was no closed session, so there's nothing to report.
Thank you. We are now on the council matters, manager matters, and I'd like, as mayor, to take the prerogative at the beginning of council matters to ask Melanie DeFay and Sue Ellen Sterling to join me up here, please. Both of us? Whatever you want, Barbara. Some of you may recognize these women, some of you may not, but they have played a big part in our community. For the last 24 years, over the past 24 years, they have been the owners behind our farmers market. And in these 24 years, thousands of people each Sunday go to the farmers market, and has given great joy, I know, to our community. I watch the folks walking toward the farmers market every Sunday. I've watched them over the years. These two women, however, have decided to retire, and so the council has signed a commendation for them because we so appreciate what they have done. They told me that they didn't want to speak. They still feel that way. They don't want to speak, but we should speak with applause, thanking them for all they have done. And a standing ovation, no less.
Can't beat that.
You can't. So here's your commendation. Thank you both. Enjoy your time off.
Will. Thank you,
Okay.
Barbara.
Thank you. Oh, wait a minute. We have a photo op.
With you, I hope.
Yes.
Why not, huh?
Okay.
Why not? Thank you.
Another round of applause for them, too. So we will now continue on with council matters in the normal progression. Ms. Jensen.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Since our last council meeting, I have attended, apropos of our study session earlier, a Route 85 policy committee, and that committee is deciding on goals for what it wants to take forward to the VTA, and criteria for projects, and importantly, policies that it wants to see implemented along the Route 85 corridor to include alternative modes of transportation, we're very focused on, and just a very, very preliminary discussion of some projects. I, along with the Vice Mayor, attended the policy meeting of the Policy Committee last week. We discussed use of town facilities, among other things. And I also attended the Santa Clara Valley Water District Board Committee. I always want to call it Water Board. I know that's not a good thing to call it. But I attended that, and we received reports regarding the state of our water. It's rained a lot. However, our reservoirs are still at only about 37% capacity, although there's lots of snow in the Sierra, and we're making good progress, but we're not there yet. So we are still urging everyone to continue with their conservation efforts, and the water authorities are calling us to conserve at least through June, and then they'll reassess.
Thank you. Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I have two things to report. Last night I attended the Housing and Community Development Advisory Committee for the county. That is the advisory board that advises the supervisors on how to allocate community development grant from the federal government. And we made our recommendations last night on how those should be allocated, and after listening to presentations by the different grantees, and that committee is now done until next October. Last week I attended the League of Cities dinner where we had two speakers. One was Housing California, that talked about affordable housing, a subject that keeps coming up. And also the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, they also talked about the need for affordable housing, but they also talked about transportation. One of their efforts that was interesting was trying to get all the different transit agencies in the area to start working together. If you go to any transit stop, you don't have a map on how to get from San Jose to Oakland, for example. So their first goal is to try to get maps of how you could connect all of those together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rennie. Since the last meeting, I, along with Mr. Leonardis, had a Finance Committee meeting, and what we are doing is we're continuing to examine our unfunded liabilities, and now specifically examining can the town pay any part of it down, and do we want to? Is it a financially wise decision? We're going to continue with that subject matter, and it is our hope to bring it back to the full council as soon as possible. I had two ribbon cuttings for new businesses that we welcomed to Los Gatos. One is Lone Star Lending, which is on Los Gatos Boulevard, and then another one is We Olive on Santa Cruz Avenue. Along with other people here, I also attended a meeting having to do with transportation. This was the West Valley and North County mayors invited to a meeting with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. And the concept there was, even though the West Valley, North County mayors have a a proposed allocation of tax monies. The Silicon Valley Leadership Group has a different concept that Mr. Gardino was discussing with us earlier. And lastly, on my own behalf as mayor, I would like to invite all of you to the State of the Town message, which I will be delivering on the meeting of Monday, March 1st. Ms. Sayak.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In addition to the policy committee that Councilmember Johnson had already mentioned, I did attend the swearing-in ceremony for our new officer, Michelle Viviano, and that was January 22nd.
In addition to the Finance Committee, as Mayor Spector already mentioned, I attended the Housing and Community Development Advisory Committee meeting on Monday, January 25th, a week prior to Councilmember Rennie's attendance, where the agencies looking for grants from the Housing and Community Development Advisory Committee did their presentations.
Thank you all. Manager reports.
Yes, thank you. I have 3 items to report. First of all, on Thursday evening, we are holding a reception in the chambers to recognize the art of our high school students that is newly installed here in the chambers. The public is welcome to join us on Thursday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. here in the chambers. On a second item of celebration is the 4th anniversary of our library. That celebration will be happening on February 11th from 4 to 5:30 at our library. And third, we'd like to announce that we are continuing to recruit for boards and commissions. Applications are due for our adult commissions on February 19th and our student commissions on May 9th. Thank you.
Thank you. And for members of our community who may have noticed a difference in the agenda with the numbering, could you just explain why? And also, is this going to be something they're going to continue to see?
Thank you very much. For this packet, for February 2nd, we tried new software that is associated with the software that allows us to live stream our council meetings. It's called Granicus. And this trial essentially looked at how we could streamline our agenda management process through some software called Peak Agenda. The software has a set way of doing numbering and a set way of loading up the staff reports. We appreciate the patience of the council and the public as we work through some bugs. It was challenging on the staff end, and I want to recognize Shannon and Shelley in particular for really trying to make this work as seamlessly as possible. Jen Calloway, our assistant town manager, also spent many hours to try and make this work, so I appreciate everyone's patience. We are still piloting it. We are not convinced that this is necessarily a product that's going to work for our town, given our goals of accessibility and transparency, but we're continuing to explore it. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next item on our agenda is the consent calendar, and the consent calendar currently consists of items 1.1 to 1.6. All of those items will be considered in one motion unless a member of the council or a member of the audience pulls an item from the agenda. Does anyone from the council wish to pull an item from the consent calendar? Seeing no one. Does anyone from the audience, wish to pull an item from the consent calendar? Seeing no one coming forward, may I have a motion? Ms. Sayak?
I move to approve the consent items listed in our agenda as 1.1 to 1.6.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Discussion, hearing none, may I have a motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you. We now have verbal communications. If anyone wants to speak to us on verbal communications, please submit one of these cards. Verbal communications is the opportunity for any of you to speak on an item that is not on our agenda. So at this point, we have one card, and I would ask Ann Robinson to please come forward.
Ann Robinson, Charter Oaks. Being on the board of directors of the Charter Oaks community, I offered to contact Matt Morley to discuss issues with the Charter Oaks Drive and Lark Avenue intersection. Residents of Charter Oaks are concerned about the difficulty getting into and out of the Charter Oaks community, not only for themselves, but for their families, friends, workers, service vehicles, and people using the Creek Trail. I reached out to Matt a week ago last Saturday, and Matt was very responsive and nice enough to meet me on the following Monday. We discussed options of improving the flow of traffic so it does not back up past the Charter Oaks Drive, blocking our egress and ingress, which would reduce wait times. And we also discussed ways of improving the safety of the intersection. During this discussion, he mentioned that the town was going to fix the Los Gatos Creek Trail flooding. When I relayed all this information from my meeting with Matt at the Board of Directors meeting at Charter Oaks last Thursday, I was questioned about the intended use of the $350,000 from the lawsuit. Some of the board members thought that the $350,000 from the Albright lawsuit settlement was intended to mitigate any unforeseen impacts of the Albright development in the surrounding area, especially impacts related to increased traffic congestion. Those questions regarding the use of the $350,000 brought about research, more questions, and emails to the town, which you received this week. The conditions written in the Albright lawsuit settlement states that the community benefit payment shall be used by Los Gatos for purposes determined by Los Gatos in its sole discretion, provided that such uses shall be related to the project's implementation with high priority to traffic congestion, and such uses shall be for the benefit of the Los Gatos community, and such funds shall be expended in proximity to the project. I really support preventing the flooding of the Los Gatos Creek Trail. The creek has been flooding the trail ever since I bought my Charter Oaks home in 1993. I just don't believe the flooding of the creek trail is related to the project's implementation. I heard yesterday that the $350K was not to be used for the preventing of the flooding of the creek trail. I also received an email stating that there will be a public hearing held to discuss the allocation of the funds related to the Albright settlement. My hopes is that these funds are not used prematurely and the town waits until the Albright development is completely built and occupied so we can assess the full impact of the development and then have the aforementioned public hearing and decide the best way to disperse the funds to mitigate any impacts related to the project's implementation, with special attention paid to the increased traffic congestion caused by the Albright development and the visual impacts to the area in proximity to the project.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. We have questions for her. We have staff input. Well, I see none right now. See, I let you finish your sentence, and you really know how to draw it out.
Thank you.
Oh, Ms. Robinson, we do have a question.
Perhaps this question is for staff.
Why don't you, Mr. Leonardis, go ahead, we'll see.
Okay. So obviously there was a settlement, and you had pointed out the terms of the settlement. What do you think would be the best approach? Do you think agendizing this subject? It is $350,000. I will defer to the town manager or perhaps the town attorney. It is a considerable amount of money, and I thought that there was some limitation where council would have to intervene if these funds were going to be spent.
Yes, thank you very much. We are in receipt of the emails that occurred over the weekend. We have made this a council referral, so staff is working on a response. We believe that this is appropriate for a council agenda item so that there is public discussion as well as council decision on the appropriate use of those funds. We have not yet made that schedule known yet as we continue to wait for full occupancy and look at the different options for the use of the funds.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Leonardis?
One follow-up, Mayor Spector. So should we request at this point in time that this could be put on a future agenda when so appropriate?
I believe that that is going to happen, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? No, thank you, and thank you, Ms. Robinson. That was the only card I had for verbal communications. Does anyone else wish to address us on verbal communications? No cards, no one coming forward. We will now go to the public hearings. Public hearing number 1 has many subsets, but I'm just going to call it by its overall title, which is Community Choice Energy. This is number 2.1. Mr. Morley.
Good evening, Matt Morley, Director of Parks and Public Works. Last year we brought you Community Choice Energy, excuse me while I get set up here, and had a brief discussion. I'll cover a little bit of that to refresh our memories on what Community Choice Energy is, and then cut to the chase on this one. As you may recall, Community Choice Energy is a way for a community to purchase energy on the market in a way different than purchasing it directly from PG&E. PG&E continues to remain the provider of the transmission line, so they're the ones who get the power to your house. But there's an alternate source behind that source behind that energy. Communities are considering Community Choice Energy, or CCE, for a number of reasons. I should start by saying the transportation and electricity consumption are the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. So being able to affect that is an important way of reducing greenhouse gas, and alternatives such as renewable power are something that Community Choice Energy provides for. Let me move forward here. The partnership, as it started locally, began with 4 original partners: Sunnyvale, Cupertino, Mountain View, and the unincorporated and Santa Clara County unincorporated areas of the county. As they began this project, they conducted a study and then followed that study with a technical study and included additional partners at that point when they realized that it could be a viable region-wide implementation. As you can see by this chart, Los Gatos is in about the middle of the pack in terms of energy users. And so as this developed, an organization called Silicon Valley Community Choice Energy Partnership was formulated. It's a loose coalition of the partners that you saw on the previous slide. The partners are working towards what we're asking for you for tonight, which is the implementation of a JPA that will facilitate the implementation of community choice energy throughout the partnership cities. The partnership has established a number of goals, including providing options to renewable energy supply that exceed what PG&E provides, so being more green in terms of renewable energy, the ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, providing competitive rates and potentially lower electricity rates for all customers, and facilitating the use of clean technology, all of this while managing a JPA that is well managed and financially sustainable. So the technical study that I mentioned examined several options, and what the technical study did was bookended the options so that it was conservative in several areas. The study shows that with a distribution of energy that is similar to PG&E, that it could potentially achieve a 3% savings and still match or exceed what PG&E provides in terms of renewable energy. And it went up to a more aggressive scenario where it achieved rate parity, so the rates that the end user saw would not change from where their PG&E rates are, with significantly greater renewable and greenhouse gas emission reductions. They did this study over the immediate 1-year term and then also over a 10-year term so they could see the effect over time. And in both cases, it showed to be a viable option. As with anything, there's risks associated with it. The study did a pretty detailed job in looking at the risk, doing a risk analysis and testing some sensitivities. There are some mitigation measures that could be put in place and some ultimate risks that have been discussed and accounted for. And ultimately, the rates and the assumptions that were included in the technical study accounted for these risks, and for instance, where there were a potential for rate increases, factored those into the assessment. There was a number of community outreach meetings that have been held and continue to be held, including one here in Los Gatos. There's a business engagement meeting to reach out to the business side that will be done online. That will be on February 3rd. And then most importantly, this is an opt-out program, so customers have the ability to opt out of the program if they so choose. Customers are noticed via mail by CPUC regulations twice prior to service being implemented and twice afterwards, so a total of at least 4 times. Of course, the JPA, when it is formed, can consider that and increase those numbers even further. To provide an overview of where things are at now, several agencies have already adopted it and several others are in progress. This is sort of the scorecard of what is occurring as we speak. We have several potential actions for you to consider. Tracking wrong because I uploaded the wrong item, but let me. So we have the public hearing tonight, and I'm sorry, I got the wrong item up there. We have the public hearing tonight, and ultimately a potential resolution to join the JPA and approve the cost sharing contribution. The cost sharing contribution for the town will be $150,000, with $50,000 of that being a contingency amount that would cover additional costs should any of the cities that were included in the prior list choose not to participate and provide their contribution. The first JPA meeting would be in April 2016, and the entire program is scheduled to go live in the winter of 16-17. We are also looking for the council to appoint a JPA representative and an alternative. The alternate representative, the JPA rep, should be a council member per the JPA requirements. The alternate could be a staff member or a council member. That would be at the council's discretion. And with that sort of awkwardly concludes the staff's report, and we're here for questions.
Thank you. And if the council looks to the agenda, whether it's on our iPad or a hard copy, you can see the items that Mr. Morley was referring to as to the decision points for this council. Questions for Mr. Morley? Ms. Jensen.
Mr. Morley, I have 2 questions for you. The first is about the community outreach meeting. I noticed in the staff report that an entire 3 people attended. So I'm curious as to what kind of outreach was done or notification was done, what the staff report doesn't reveal what those 3 people had to say. So I'm curious about that.
So there were indeed 3 people who attended. The outreach included next door. There was an article in the weekly that covered the program in general, so there was outreach from that perspective. The item was posted on the website with our council agenda and also on What's New and on other social media outlets as we continue to grow those. The members that attended were provided a presentation that informed them on what the community choice energy actually means. They provided input on what they thought their tolerance was or their interest was in terms of renewable energy and how that affected rates and what their preferences might be in terms of that information. Generally, it was that there was some tolerance for rate increases towards rate parity that would also balance out greenhouse gas reductions or renewable energy opportunities. There have been numerous other outreach efforts, including in Campbell and Saratoga, which are fairly close, that are open broadly to the region and not necessarily just to those jurisdictions.
And I have a question on a different subject. With respect to the $150,000, the town is looking for funds for capital improvements, looking for funds for lots of different things. The staff report says that the $150,000 is supposed to come from 2014-15 year-end savings. I'm wondering, what is that? And what is the argument to spend the $150,000 on this versus other projects that the town might want to undertake?
I'll let Assistant Town Manager handle that in just a second, but did want to mention that as per the previous report, the intent of the JPA is to pay those dollars back to the town. The intent is to do that within a 4-year time frame. The other jurisdictions, the other locales where a similar community choice energy effort has been put in place, was able to do that far quicker than the 4-year time frame that they outlined. But leave it to the Assistant Town Manager.
Thank you. So the recommendation in the staff report is to take 150 from fiscal year 14-15 year in excess, and that is the amount of money that we closed 14-15 with. So June 30th, 2015. We're in the process of bringing that forward to you at mid-year, which is scheduled for March 1st. It's $5.3 million right now. You'll recall that $2 million of that has been set aside for Almond Grove already. So you have about $3.3 million left. By council policy, that would go right to capital funding for next year. So we're asking to divert $150,000 of that now, and the remainder would go to council to the capital project.
Further questions? Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Mr. Morley, this is an interesting concept, but there's really no hard data. What if only 3 of our residents in Los Gatos, the 3 who showed up at the meeting, opted to participate in this alternative energy choices, and we spent $150,000? It seems like not a very strong return. So I guess what I'm looking for is some real data. How much is our carbon footprint going to be reduced before we commit to spending money that we could spend on a police officer, fixing the Old Town Bridge artwork, giving every employee $1,000 bonus, senior needs $50,000 a year for the next 3 years, those kinds of things?
Clearly, there's a competition for the dollars and the resources. The program is an opt-out program, so the residents would be signed up for it and provided the opportunity to opt out. The other jurisdictions have found that upwards of 85% of the residents have actually participated and continued to participate in the program. So it's been successful across those jurisdictions and shown actual rate savings to the end users, to the residents of the town, and paired that with greenhouse gas reductions, as was highlighted in the table in the presentation. The JPA would ultimately set the targets on what those reductions are and what they would want to achieve, how aggressive they'd want to be, and that would be something that would be determined over time as the JPA is formed. Again, it's between the technical study and the implementations that have already been made determines sort of the guidelines of what we would expect for a return in this particular opportunity.
Mr. Leonardis.
One more, thank you. And with these joint powers authorities, I noticed obviously the majority of the cities in the valley here are already in process or potentially signed up. What is the voting power that we would have? We would have 1 seat on a board of 13 or 15, or is that?
Yeah, we would have 1 seat on the board, and we would have equal voting power for the predominance of votes. If there was something that was passed that needed a 2/3 vote, then it becomes a population-based vote. But for normal course of business, it's a 1-for-1 vote. Each member entity has 1 vote for their seat.
Thank you.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you. I do have speaker cards. First speaker, Mike Balma.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I'm with a nonprofit solar organization, and so I've got some familiarity with what's going on. We've done installations in Los Gatos as well as around the Bay Area, and a lot of the folks that have been interested in this have been the folks that already have solar, and so oftentimes the question comes up in that regard, well, how's this going to affect me? And we've actually worked with other jurisdictions, such as Marin Clean Energy in particular, and who's been in operation for 5 years now, saving their customers money and having lower greenhouse gases. And so as we've worked with those customers, we've been able to implement solar with those customers with no problem. Of course, each jurisdiction gets to decide what rules it's going to go by, but as the JPA states, it does support local energy. And so in Marin, they've actually pay solar customers an extra penny per kilowatt hour. So it's a good deal for customers. The transactions work through PG&E without a problem of what we've seen with Marin and Sonoma. And so from that standpoint, I urge you to provide a choice for your customers to have cleaner and greener energy at a lower price. One of the things that I'm from Mountain View, and one of the things that as we looked at it, this was the single most cost-effective thing we could do to reduce our carbon footprint and save money at the same time, because the city, through the lights and the things, if you can save 1 or 2% on that, that turns into thousands of dollars. And your businesses can also see that kind of savings as well. So again, I urge you to move forward with this. If you're in the early stage, then you get a voice in how it's set up. So from that standpoint, I appreciate your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Boma? Seeing none, thank you, sir. Next speaker, Bruce Carney.
Good evening, Mayor Spector and members of the City Council. I live in Mountain View. I'm the president of the board of an organization called Carbon Free Mountain View. We were formed 2.5 years ago to try to work with our city government to reduce our carbon footprint so that the city of Mountain View could achieve the greenhouse gas reductions required under AB 32. 8 years ago, I was selected as the chair of Mountain View's Environmental Sustainability Task Force, a group of 50 individuals. And in that context, we presented 89 recommendations to our city, which form the basis of the climate action plan that Mountain View is currently implementing. I'm embarrassed to say that Community Choice Energy was not one of our 89 recommendations because at that time Marin had not yet proven the concept. Marin's Clean Energy Authority has been in operation now for 5 years and has increased its greenhouse gas-free electricity year over year and kept its prices at or below PG&E's prices. As was mentioned by the staff member who spoke, the opt-out rate is on the order of 15% in Marin and 10% in Sonoma County. So, Councilmember Leonardis, I don't think you'll have to worry that only 3 Los Gatans will be participating. I'd also like to say that when Mountain View had its community outreach meeting, 115 people attended. And I've also seen the summary data from all of the surveys that were done in all of the outreach meetings, and what I recall is that 96% of the attendees were in favor of the adoption of community choice energy in their jurisdiction. So when I've talked to other city councils, and I believe this is the 6th or 7th time I've spoken on behalf of this measure, and by the way, all the other councils have adopted this unanimously in places as far apart as Saratoga and Morgan Hill. I usually emphasize the debt that we owe to the young people who will live to see the year 2100, and I see there are 2 such young people in the front row of the audience right now. I'm not sure how I could look those young ladies in the eye if I didn't do everything I could to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that will take place over the next 10 or 20 years. This is essentially a cost-neutral item to the city. You'll get all the money back in 4 years that you invest. It's a cost savings to the businesses and residents of Los Gatos, and it has an enormous environmental impact. All those 89 recommendations that my committee came up with all those years ago don't have added together the impact that this measure has. So I would urge you, on behalf of your current residents, on behalf of your future residents, the children and grandchildren of Los Gatos, to vote yes.
Thank you, sir. Questions for Mr. Carney? Seeing none. Next card, Angelia Dorner.
Hello, Angelia Joyner, proud resident of the Almond Grove. I happen to be one of the three. And I think outreach has been basically transparent to the majority of residents in town. The article in the newspaper did not say what time or date the meeting was and did not give contact information on how to find out when or if that meeting would be happening. I personally found out about it on Nextdoor just 3 days before the meeting. The few people who responded saying I couldn't go, how can I get information, really did not get any feedback from anybody. But I was here, and I think my biggest concern is, well, let me back up for a moment. The very night that you guys talked about this first, I sort of thought it was funny. I was a little wired when I got home and had a Comcast mailing. And the Comcast mailing was this great offer to get your electricity through Comcast. And it was this exact same thing that you guys are talking about here. And they were offering marketing potentials and free theater cards and all kinds of things. And you're going to get your get your electricity cheaper, maybe, and all of these other types of deals. So I mean, I learned a lot from reading all of the fine print in that Comcast mailer. So, this is not a new thing. There's going to be a barrage of these kinds of things out there, and I think if we do get involved, we need to distinguish ourselves from those as who we are serving, where a commercial enterprise versus a governing agency. The other thing is that this is taking transparency to a new height. Not many people will know that this is going on because the billing goes through the same electrical PG&E bill. Your bill doesn't change. The look of it doesn't change. They may do all the maintaining. They are the ones who get called to do all servicing. So to an individual, a resident who doesn't know about this through some other way, they're not knowing that this thing has taken place. Therefore, how do they know about the opt-out or know that they should be assessing their own electrical costs to determine if they should opt out? So I think there needs to be a lot of additional outreach that needs to be done and some consideration for this fact that it's transparency to a new height. I wish we had that in all of our things, but we don't. And in this, I think it's going to be extremely critical because it's not fair to just let it sneak up on folks. The other thing, just as the Mountain View and Cupertino results need to be tempered a little bit because of their large commercial enterprises, not just the population impact, but the Googles and the Apples and the huge conglomerate campuses that they have apparently are the ones who are contributing a huge amount of these savings and things that are showing up in their numbers. The last thing is that with the market volatility in the energy market, especially since the beginning of the year, that will continue. And I'm concerned about a government agency getting involved with futures and forward contracts and those types of financial instruments.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Dorner? Seeing none, I have no other cards. Does anybody else want to address us on this agenda item? No one is coming forward. I will close the public testimony part of this hearing and look now to the council for questions, discussion, motion. Ms. Sayak.
I actually have no questions, and I'm ready to make a motion, but in case there are further questions.
Well, yes, I mean, you don't have to wait for the questions. You can go ahead and make your motion, and I'm just going to, I don't know what your motion's going to be, but I will draw your attention to the agenda and the components of any motion as suggested by council, by staff.
Okay. Okay. So full transparency, I was also one of the three in attendance at the community meeting. And it was a valuable thing in that we've discussed about transparency. It was in the newspaper, it was in Nextdoor, and we've just discussed it here publicly. But this is also part of the larger discussion we've had for many years about our sustainability in the town and the actions that we need to do on our own level to address the global climate change. It's documented in science, and it's documented in our sustainability plan, and it's actually quite well documented in the technical study for anyone that would like to actually review it. So I've studied it in detail. We have a living example in Marin based on what is before us on the record, as well as the comments that I completely appreciate. I think it's a wise choice. It provides opportunities for our residents, and I think it's the right thing to do. So based on that, I move that we We've heard a public hearing, but I also move that we do the first reading of Ordinance 2250, which is summarized in our staff report, to authorize the implementation of a community choice aggregation program. I also move to adopt a resolution to approve the Joint Powers Authority Agreement, which is in Attachment 2, which establishes and authorizes participation in the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority. I authorize the town manager to remit up to $150,000 to the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority to support the initial costs, understanding where that's coming from, and that's part of a larger discussion that we'll be having in the future. Approve the appropriation of $150,000 from fiscal year 2014-15 to support funding the initial costs, and appoint a council member as the town representative to the JPA and alternate representative. I understand that's the mayoral discretion, but understanding all the responsibilities involved, I'd be happy to support the town in that regard as well.
We have a motion. Mr. Rennie?
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I'll go ahead and second the motion. I agree with the Vice Mayor that I don't think there's anything we can do to have a bigger effect on our sustainability goals, and I don't think the risk is very high here. The risk is we lose $150,000 is what's been presented to us. We should get the $150,000 back. It looks like all the other jurisdictions are going to join in, which gives it the synergy to make sure this is a successful venture. And it seems to me that we'd be really remiss if we didn't give our citizens the opportunity to do this. It's really, we're giving them a choice. We're not even forcing them into something. So I'm seconding the motion, and I'm willing to also be an alternate to the JPA.
I'm going to support the motion, and what I would suggest with regard to the representative is that anyone, assuming this motion passes, which it's going to now, that anyone who wishes to represent the council on this board submit his or her names to me by the end of tomorrow, and then the mayor will go ahead and make the appointment. I am supporting this motion for the reasons outlined by the person who made the motion and who seconded the motion, but to the extent that there are any concerns about whether or not community members want to participate, the factor that is significant to me is the fact that one makes the decision to participate and can also make the decision thereafter not to participate. Further discussion. Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I was going to pose this question for staff, but at this point it looks like the motion will pass anyway. But economic decisions like this, I think, are best handled at budget time. And for some reason, this one came not even at our mid-year budget session. It's asking us to commit $150,000. I know there is potentially a promise of getting that money back. I see no hard data on that. So for me, I look at spending $150,000. I'd rather spend it cleaning up our freeways or something, and I will not be supporting the motion. I think we have other uses for this money in town at this time. And as far as global warming and all those things, I'm not a believer, so I'm not going to vote for this one.
Further discussion. See none, we have a motion. All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
No.
Passes 4-1. Thank you. We are now on agenda item 2.2. This agenda item is called the medical marijuana cultivation and delivery. Do we have a staff report?
Yes, good evening, Mayor and Council. In 2011, the town adopted an ordinance prohibiting medical marijuana dispensaries, or also known as medical marijuana stores, in the town. The current ordinance does not specifically prohibit cultivation and delivery, although there is a reference to prohibiting mobile dispensaries. In October 2015, just last year, Governor Brown signed into law a new legislation entitled the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act to regulate medical marijuana. The new law creates a new state agency called the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulations under the California Department of Consumer Affairs. The new law contains a provision that states that cities and towns must have an ordinance regulating or prohibiting cultivation and delivery of marijuana by March 1st, 2016, or the state will become the sole licensing agency and authority for the cultivation and delivery of medical marijuana. Staff has prepared both an ordinance and an urgency ordinance to make certain that the town has both an adopted and effective ordinance by the March 1st, 2016 deadline. Both ordinances prohibit the delivery and cultivation of marijuana. The delivery and cultivation of marijuana can create problems. There's been many studies that have revealed relating to public health and safety, crime, water and air quality, and energy consumption. There's also been studies done on medical marijuana dispensaries that can create nuisance activities such as loitering and criminal activities in the business and residential areas. Based upon these secondary effects, staff is recommending that you pass both the ordinances and the ordinance and the urgency ordinance prohibiting the delivery of cultivation of medical marijuana. Because they are two separate ordinances, we request that you, if you do adopt our recommendation, that you take those as separate motions and you adopt the ordinance by title and read by the clerk administrator. I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Questions? Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Mr. Schultz, what do you define as the delivery of marijuana, medical marijuana?
The delivery is defined under the business and professional codes, and I can print out the exact language, but that's any time there is delivery that is sold from a moving vehicle.
Thank you.
Other questions? Ms. Jensen.
Process question. The urgency ordinance, in order to be enacted, needs to pass by a four-fifths vote, but not the regular ordinance. I'm sorry. So do you want the motions to be done separately and voted on separately?
Yes.
Okay. Other questions of staff? Seeing none, I don't have any cards, but if anyone in the audience wishes to address us on the agenda item, please come forward. You'll have 3 minutes. Seeing that no one is coming forward, I will close the public testimony part of the hearing and look to the council for questions, discussion, or motion. Ms. Jensen.
I'll try motion. My motion is first to waive the reading of both the ordinance and the urgency ordinance and ask the clerk administrator to read the title of those proposed ordinances. And I guess to do it separately, that would be my first motion.
Yes, I would. That's how I would do it, Mr. Schultz.
That's correct.
Please.
I guess there'd have to be a second.
I'll second.
An ordinance of the Town of Los Gatos amending Los Gatos Municipal Code Title 18, Section 14.120, prohibiting the establishment of medical marijuana dispensaries to further prohibit marijuana cultivation and deliveries.
We have a motion and a second. Discussion. Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. Ms. Jensen?
All right, I would make a motion to adopt the regular ordinance of the Town of Los Gatos, amending Los Gatos Municipal Code Title 18, Section 14.120, prohibiting the establishment of medical marijuana dispensaries, and to further prohibit marijuana cultivation and deliveries, which is found at sequentially numbered page 172 of the staff report.
And to have the clerk read that by title?
I hoped we had done that, but if we haven't, yes.
We did the regular ordinance. This would be the urgency ordinance.
I'm making the motion on the regular ordinance.
Yeah, and that's been done.
And I believe you've read that, correct?
I did, yes.
Okay.
All right, so where are we now?
A vote on the motion.
Second on the motion.
We don't have a second yet. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Discussion? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously.
Okay. And lastly, I would make a motion to adopt the urgency ordinance found at sequentially numbered page 181 of the staff report, which amends Los Gatos Municipal Code Title 18, Section 14.120, and ask the clerk to read the title.
Second.
An urgency ordinance of the Town of Los Gatos amending Los Gatos Municipal Code Title 18, Section 14.120, prohibiting the establishment of medical marijuana dispensaries to further prohibit marijuana cultivation and deliveries.
Discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. And Ms. Jensen, you're on a roll.
I thought it was done.
I'm done with that one, but I have to interrupt and say that we need to go back to the last item because we didn't do that by title and number only, or didn't read the full ordinance. So we would need the clerk, we need a motion on number, that was
The regular ordinance?
2.1, the community choice energy, the motion,
Oh.
the ordinance that was adopted be read by title and.
All right, before we do that, though, have we completed this agenda item, the 2.2?
Yes.
All right, so what you're asking us to do then is go back to 2.1. May we have a motion on 2.1? Ms. Sayak?
I move to read the title of the ordinance of 2.1.
Second?
Ordinance of the Town of Los Gatos authorizing the implementation of a community choice aggregation program.
Discussion? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Passes 4-1. Mr. Schultz, anything further on these two items? Thank you. We are now on Agenda Item 2.3, Town Code Amendment A 15004, Formula Retail Definition. Ms. Rennie. Ms. Wren.
Good evening, Monica Wren, Economic Vitality Manager for the town. Before you tonight, we're bringing back the Formula Retail Ordinance for your consideration. I'll back up a little bit here. There we are. And kind of review. On September 1st, the council considered several retail items and asked for those items to come back in individual sections for discussion. So on October 6th, we did bring the formula retail amendment back and just the provisions in general back for your discussion. That night, we talked a little bit about the addition of restaurants. We talked about the number of locations, where they exist, United States versus worldwide. And from that, the council also had a little bit of a discussion about just the idea of formula retail in general, and made the recommendation for an amendment, or made the recommendation for the Planning Commission to take a look and discuss this issue. So on January 13th, the Planning Commission did discuss the amendment that staff proposed. They made a motion to recommend approval to you as the council, and did have some further discussion points which weren't a part of their motion. One being that they felt if formula retail does exist and those provisions remain in our code, that there should be some sort of ratio established so that when a business comes forward to the Planning Commission, they have something to think about or something to consider at some point. Is what number's too many, or do we have a number in mind at all? They were also made the comment that while they were recommending approval, they thought that this was just a piece of a larger discussion. So they were recommending the approval to provide the clarity, to provide the qualifiers in the definition, but felt there might need to be a greater discussion taking place. So that brings us here tonight. We have three options before you that were outlined in the staff report. You can accept the recommendation of the Planning Commission as it's stated. You can accept the recommendation to amend the definition with maybe further amendments of your own tonight, or you can not accept the Planning Commission's recommendation and make no changes. Based on past discussion and based on some questions that we received that were in the desk item this afternoon, Council does have the option to consider additional amendments, either to how the provisions are applied, the zoning that they're applied in, or the CUP process in general, which deciding body does that, et cetera. So staff is here to support you on that conversation if you'd like to have it, and to answer any further questions you may have tonight.
Thank you. I had a question. Remind me, because we had several Planning Commission meetings that I was looking at. What was the vote on the formula retail that they are recommending to us?
It was 3-2, 4-3, sorry, wrong. 4-3, and the three that were opposed, primarily opposed because of the United States statement. A lot of them really felt like one person made the statement that you would be punishing a U.S. business versus a worldwide business if you were looking at just U.S. locations. So that was a real sticking point, I think, for a couple of the decision makers.
Thank you. Other questions? Seeing none, thank you. Ms. Wren? Oh, we have a question. Ms. Sayak.
Okay, so I watched the Planning Commission hearing, and I loved the discussion that they had, and one of the things that really stood out was just their idea that our current definition, the tweaks that we would like to make, really provide no value. That's the takeaway for me, and that whether it's 7, whether it's U.S., whether it's worldwide, what is the overall problem we're trying to address? And could you confirm that they were looking at that a larger discussion ought to happen rather than focusing on this tiny change?
Yeah, so I think that discussion, that problem that they were trying to solve also related more heavily to the next item that evening, which was the seating and parking. That was the question that just kept coming up with that issue. But they did say, they didn't feel like this was an incredible value. What it did is it just provided clarity for staff and for businesses. So from a staff perspective, there is value in that, that when a business comes to us, we can say, this is why we're saying your formula. We do often get the questions about, well, we have 6 separate LLCs, or, we have a different tax ID or whatever it is. So we needed those criteria to really help businesses and to help the staff make the determination. So there is value in that. The bigger discussion, I think, is probably a lot of what you raised in your questions through the email is just, where does this fit in? And what are we trying to do? And from a staff perspective, I think we're trying to make the permitting process easier, to provide more opportunity, to really give downtown and the whole town a competitive edge to attract businesses and to make opportunities for these new kind of businesses and these new business models to be able to be here and to want to be here.
Further discussion? Questions? Thank you. You have a question? He's discussion. All right, thank you. Do we have anyone who wishes to address us on this item? I do not have any cards. Seeing no one coming forward, I will close the public testimony portion of this hearing and look to the council for questions, discussion, motion. Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I just wanted to address what Ms. Wren was talking about. The question was, is this really making a difference? And one of the questions I asked that they answered in our desk item that maybe everybody didn't have to get a chance to read, which I think does make a difference, was they added the definition of restaurant to that, and I said, well, what good does restaurant do? And the implication that they're saying here is if a non-formula restaurant leaves, you still need a CUP, but the incoming restaurant, if it was a formula restaurant, would now have to modify the CUP. In other words, we're encouraging a non-formula restaurant to be replaced by a non-formula restaurant, which I think is a good thing. So I see some advantage to that. So I just want to make that comment.
Thank you. And I also saw a benefit to the line items of the ordinance as ultimately adopted by the Planning Commission. Further discussion? All right, Ms. Sayak.
Okay, so this is an area where actually I keep circling around. And when this was before us initially, I was in support of keeping the formula retails as currently defined and actually adding restaurants. But after hearing the Planning Commission discussion and actually reading the CUP language again, it occurred to me that, one, with restaurants, one perspective also to look at it is that we're double regulating restaurants in a way, because incoming restaurants do require CUPs, and then having another review of it where you're really looking at the same values and the same findings is a repetitive duplication. So that's one thing that I was considering. But I kept going back to what is our overall intent of the formula retail and the overall intent of all these economic issues we keep discussing. And everything that I've heard from everyone involved in the business is it's a changing dynamic environment and that we have to be able to quickly adapt to it. And what I'm learning is by having something in our ordinance, we don't have the ability to quickly adapt. And so I had asked the question of, can we remove the definition in our ordinance of formula retail so that it's just, we're classifying businesses as they are, it's a restaurant, it's retail, and then within the CUP process, that gives us the ability to actually look at what the benefits of that business is doing. So the recommendation that's actually in the desk item of just opting to amend Town Code Section 29.10.020 to omit formula retail is something that I would favor at this moment. So.
Discussion. Ms. Jensen.
I agree with the Vice Mayor. I always have, but I think that just on this issue, I guess, I am, as I've stated before, in favor of deregulating our downtown. I think that we have all the tools in place that we need to have to decide whether we want to have a business or a restaurant or not. So, for example, in our CUP, the town may grant a conditional use permit where the use of the property is essential or desirable to the public convenience or welfare, will not impair the integrity or character of the zone, et cetera, et cetera. The formula retail definition is just part of our conditional use permit ordinance, and it says that we may deny a permit if the use is not in harmony, if it changes the balance. And to me, those are just other ways of saying what is in the first section, which is general. So by imposing another layer on when we call you a formula retail, to me is making us, contrary to what Ms. Wren said, non-competitive, non-flexible, and is increasing the regulatory process, particularly with what's been recommended by the Planning Commission, which is let's include restaurants, let's include, more, there's just more layers of definition, and we have everything that we need. So, for example, in the definition in our town code for our central business district, it already says that the intent is to encourage the continuance of a viable and predominantly pedestrian-oriented central business district, and it should have a wide variety of retail, service, entertainment, etc. And I personally have faith in our Planning Commission and our deciding bodies and our citizens to come forward when something is not appropriate. But I think that by adding to an already layered definition and an already increased findings, what we do is we make it much more difficult for Los Gatos to compete and much more difficult for businesses and restaurants to be innovative. So I absolutely agree with the Vice Mayor, and if she would be willing to convert her comments into a motion, I would second it.
Ms. Sayak?
Okay, I will convert my comments into a motion then.
And you will have to make the motion.
Okay. So I move to amend Town Code Section 29.10.020 to omit the formula retail definition completely. So that's the first step of the motion.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Do we have discussion? Mr. Rennie.
I'd like to start with a question for staff. So make sure I'm remembering correctly. If you come and you are a non-formula retail, you do not need a CUP. Is that correct?
That's correct, in the downtown. And if you're outside of the downtown and you're going into a space smaller than 6,000 square feet, you can be formula without a CUP.
Okay, thank you. So let me just add then, so I'm a little bit, not particularly wanting to support this motion, and my concern is, you just gave the reasons for increasing innovation and so forth, but all you're doing is making it easier for formula retail to come in, who I don't see as being that innovative person that we want. So right now, if you are a non-formula retail, you can come in without a CUP, and we're saying, well, the CUP process helps us figure that out. So doesn't that also mean we need to amend something else here? Because if we remove formula retail, now you need no CUP at all if you're retail. Is that correct? So that, I can't support that motion. That sounds crazy to me.
Further discussion? Ms. Sayak?
And Councilmember Rennie, I've definitely given that thought as well. One of the things that I heard from the Planning Commission, as well as something that I grappled with as a commissioner, was when a CUP, an application for a CUP for formula retail comes before us, we really don't have any criteria to determine whether or not to award it. And they stated that. They stated there's no specific ratio. There's no real guidance that gives the Planning Commission criteria to determine whether or not to approve a CUP. And what I heard from them was a ratio of something would help. Now, we've been working informally on an 80-20. That's nothing that has been formalized. That's something that we can certainly formalize. We can discuss it further in a policy committee. I think that was also in the staff report, in what is the ratio that we believe is firm, and how could we then forward that on to the Planning Commission so that that's something that would be actually helpful for them. Would that be something that would be helpful?
I'm sorry, you have your motion on the table?
Yes.
Okay. And we have a second, and now we are into discussion. Mr. Rennie?
So again, if we remove the word formula retail, where does the review come in? I'm not understanding how any review at all comes in. Maybe this is a question for staff. If you could elaborate what this would look like.
So the only approvals that would be required in that case would be a business license and certificate of use and occupancy like any other retail business.
Okay, thank you.
Further discussion? I won't be supporting the motion. I think that one of the things that's made Los Gatos grand, and most specifically its downtown, is that we don't look like all the malls all over the region, the state, the nation, where you walk in and you know if you see one formula store, you're going to see another formula store. By requiring the formula stores or chain stores to go through a CUP process, there are specific findings that have to be made. And those findings are what guide you. And then that was what I would tell the Planning Commission, is those findings are what guide you. With regard to the non-chain stores, the non-formula stores, we are not requiring a CUP, and that encourages the small retail stores that we have throughout downtown and that have always made us different and special. And so I think the way we distinguish between chain stores and our small retail stores is critical to our town, critical to our downtown, and critical to what makes Los Gatos, Los Gatos. Further discussion? All right, hearing none. Okay, Marcia, you have to bounce up and down.
With all due respect to our mayor, I disagree. If I travel to Chicago and I walk the Magnificent Mile, there is no question in my mind that I am in Chicago, though it is filled with formula retail. It also has independent stores. If I go to Carmel, if I go to Washington, D.C., there are areas of that city where I'm going to see what we are categorizing in Los Gatos as formula retail, which are the very things that create new neighborhoods. So, for example, Washington, D.C. just did a renovation of a neighborhood that used to be its convention center, which wasn't the greatest neighborhood, but it was okay. They put in mixed use, apartments, condos, restaurants, a plaza, very, very vibrant area, and it is anchored by independent stores and formula retail, many of which would be very welcome in Los Gatos. So I don't think that we serve our community that well. I think Los Gatos remains unique and special. Its setting is unique and special. The way those retail would be done, I would imagine, would be unique and special, just like it is in Chicago and Washington, D.C. And I think it would be much better to have a retail storefront that is full and is operating, whether it be with a Lululemon or an independent exercise store is fine, but I think those would be popular in Los Gatos. They'd be successful. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we basically discourage them from coming to our town. And I think our town can certainly maintain its integrity if we welcome those businesses.
Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector, and I agree with everything you said. You said it eloquently, but I'd like to add a little bit to it. As I've mentioned before, some of the conferences I've gone to where they've talked about retail, as you know, the internet is killing a lot of retail. It's killing malls that are not the very special malls. The guidance that or the guidance that you tend to get out of these conferences is that you need to create something that's special. And we've got something that's special in Los Gatos, and it's because you've created something different. If we, what we're proposing in this motion is to have no control at all, that just any store wants to come in. So we have no way to guide the process. I'm not against allowing some more formula retail in here or encouraging some exciting ones, but to just let all the mom and pops be wiped out by the formula retails that can afford to pay higher rents, I think it's going to be a huge change to Los Gatos, and maybe it will be successful to start, but we now also have a large risk of being like these malls that are starting to die around the country too. So I'm definitely against this motion.
Further discussion. Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. It would be nice if there was one member of the public who wanted to come forward and speak on this evening, because I'm on the fence with this one. I could see both sides of the argument. This is very difficult. Obviously, the comments that Mr. Rennie just made, I had thought about if too many chain stores or formula retail stores or whatever you call them come into the downtown that could pay higher rents, that could exclude mom and pop stores. However, if mom and pop stores are struggling to pay the rent now and they have to compete with other centers, we lose them as well if we don't let in more vibrancy. So I am definitely struggling with this decision this evening, and I do appreciate the continued discussion up here on the dais.
Further discussion? All right, you don't have any further discussion. So I'm going to call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
No.
The motion fails 3-2. May I have another motion? Ms. Jensen.
Okay, alternatively, I would propose a motion that the Town Council does not accept the Planning Commission's recommendations. It makes no changes to the current definition of formula retail business. However, given that the Planning Commission recognized and Ms. Wren recognized that there is going to be a larger discussion of seating, parking, retail, restaurants, et cetera, with respect to our downtown, my proposal would be that we maintain the status quo now, however, that we refer the question of perhaps looking at a ratio rather than the current ordinance language and sending that to the policy committee for examination would be my motion.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second, and I will ask staff to read that motion back to me.
The motion is not to move forward with a modification to the code at this time, and instead refer the question of a ratio of formula and smaller retail to the policy committee for examination.
All right, we have a motion and a second. I have the question I always have all last year when I was on the policy committee. Is this a policy? Because I think it's an ordinance. And so I'm going to look to staff for that.
There are choices for the council. One option for the policy committee's consideration is whether or not we would like a side council policy to direct and manage formula retail. That is one option. It's also possible that the policy committee could say that they would like it to be in the code, in which case then a code amendment would be coming forward for Planning Commission recommendation and ultimately council decision. So that could be part of the discussion that the policy committee has.
Okay, so the policy committee could say we can have a side policy, side to the existing ordinance, or we could have a new or revised ordinance, which means it would go back to the Planning Commission.
Correct.
All right, and Mr. Schultz?
Depending on if that ordinance is tremendously different than the ordinance that's in front of you now, then yes, it'd go back to Planning Commission, but it might be able to come right back to council if Planning Commission has looked at the issues already in their previous hearing. So I wouldn't say for sure that it would have to go back to the Planning Commission. It is possible that it could come directly back to City Council for a decision on the ordinance.
Okay, further discussion. Ms. Jensen.
I was just going to explain what I had envisioned by the motion, which was that the policy committee would look at information and it could either recommend a policy with respect to ratios, it could recommend rescission of Section B, the definition, it could recommend retaining what we have, or it could recommend going with what the Planning Commission already recommended, but I think it's worth exploring. So that was the intent of the motion.
Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. All right, now we are on other business, 3.1, which is endorse the draft prepared allocation of the 2016 Transportation Sales Tax Measure funds. And before we get to Mr. Morley, I just wanted to give the background. I put this item on the agenda, and that it also stemmed from the meetings with the North County West Valley mayors, and that meeting suggested the allocation of proposed tax funds as there was on the chart which you have seen earlier. However, in discussions with those North Valley, West Valley, North County mayors and cities, it became apparent that a lot of the line items on that chart were specific to a city. For example, and this is just an example, but Palo Alto, maybe having the trains, the Caltrains, was very important to them because that's where they are. Or maybe the Mountain View mayor wanted the expressways because they have expressways. So there was self-interest involved in the proposed categories of funding. Then when there was the meeting last week with Silicon Valley Leadership Group, they took the distribution and they didn't have a public document for us, but they had, as Mr. Gardino alluded to, a different category and a different allocation. There was also mention at our study session about Los Gatos and that its benefit may ultimately be indirect rather than direct. For example, San Jose may get a BART, Palo Alto might get an electric train, and Los Gatos would get a more indirect benefit because those of our citizens who have to use 85 to get to Palo Alto might have a faster trip if there were expressways. So because of these the ebbs and flows of these categories, and because of the competing interests with which I have been dealing, I was really looking forward to the input from this council as to what you thought the town of Los Gatos should be doing. Staff.
Thank you, Matt Morley, Director of Parks and Public Works. I'll recap a little bit of what you may have already heard in the study session and cover a few items, cover a few loose ends. I did want to cover the status of the countywide sales tax measure, look at a little bit of towards the project list that the town fronted, identify funding and priorities, and then specifically note that the town council has not taken a position on the measure one way or the other at this point. The sales tax measure, as we talked to before, continues to proceed with discussions through multiple commissions and committees, multiple boards going forward. The Valley Transportation Plan 2040 includes 29 town-identified projects that exceed $70 million in value, 7 projects identified by others, and 600 projects, more than 600 projects in total, totaling somewhere around $49 billion. The sales tax is identified as it's being considered a half-cent sales tax that would bring in an estimated $6 billion rounded. There is an anticipated other funding solution that would come in through normal channels and new revenue sources from state and federal funds totaling $12 billion. And again, these are preliminary numbers and will be adjusted as they continue to be refined primarily by VTA staff as they look at opportunities for transportation funding. Projects will be prioritized. The VTA board will do some prioritization, and VTA staff and the TAC associated with the VTA and will provide input as to what those priorities might look like. There is specific funding set aside for things like bicycles and pedestrians, local streets, and similar funding opportunities. We've talked a lot about this chart that shows the interrelationships of individual groups. This item is more around the group in the red box, regional transportation meetings, which are attended by the mayor, the town manager, and the Parks and Public Works staff. The group has worked towards the allocation that you saw and has distributed, been the partner to one memo in terms of Los Gatos, to VTA on the project list, and the group without Los Gatos' signature sent another letter to VTA regarding the project list. The Policy Advisory Commission, the 85 Policy Advisory Board, and the TAC could all benefit from council-wide input on how the town should be positioning itself in terms of the project list that we saw earlier. Again, this project list has about $50 million worth of Los Gatos projects in local streets and roads category, and about $20 million in the bicycle and pedestrian category. A couple of loose ends that we should cover. There was some discussion previously on the county-wide study and what that might mean. As I understand it from the conversation at the mayor and managers meeting, the countywide study was an ask to look at things more holistically. So as opposed to having bolt-on projects where you bring in a rail system here or do Caltrain improvements there or busing in another location, you start to step back and look at it as it can affect the entire county. The example there that comes forward is the Highway 85 corridor up through the North and West Valley cities, where there's very, very limited mass transit opportunities. And so that's, I think, where that study was formulated in terms of what can come forward as a balanced solution to get folks from their homes to their workplaces. There was also some confusion with VTA around an Highway 85 corridor study. And the corridor study was an element that was considered early, and I think is still a consideration for the Highway 85 Policy Advisory Board, but wasn't what the mayors and managers were looking for. They were looking for a larger study that went out above and beyond that. So those are a couple clarifications that I thought would be useful for you going into this discussion. We do have the allocation of projects here. The number 3 item on that list is that study. It's a broad allocation for the study and for a potential set aside for solutions. And again, this is the county-wide study that the mayors and managers have put forward as a draft for potential categories. I've put forward a couple, the recommendation with the staff memo and some alternatives for you to consider. Obviously, the last one is another action or other action that comes out of the discussion here. But you could endorse the draft preferred allocation as is recommended, and provide recommendation would provide some latitude to the mayor and the manager to do some advocating and adjustment to those allocations as it matured over time. You could just endorse the allocation without providing that latitude. Council could choose not to endorse the allocation or some other action, as I mentioned. With that, that concludes staff's presentation, and I'll put it back on this slide to facilitate the discussion.
I ask for questions. Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Director Morley, in the study session earlier, we heard from Mr. Gardino suggesting that the third item, the $500 million, be broken into, say, $250 million, and ask that it make sure that it goes on the West Valley sides. I guess my question for you, assuming you've been to these the mayor and managers meetings, if we ask them to modify this document to do that, are we going to lose support of the North County mayors if we do that?
So I'll start, but I've been to one of the meetings, so I don't have the history. And with the new mayor, I think the mayor's been to one meeting as well. Councilmember Jensen, I think, has been to one or more of those meetings as well. So there's a group of us that have an attendance record. I think the town manager may be the big constant across all of the meetings. So there may be additional information there. I think that the idea now is to look for consensus around this so that there's one voice coming forward. But that's why we're here, so that we can get council's input on that.
Madam Mayor, if
Yes.
you'd like, thank you. I just wanted to add that the discussions around having an allocation was a relatively new concept that actually came up when Councilmember Sayoc joined for one of the vice mayor joined me for one of the meetings. I think the biggest issue for the North and West Valley mayors was really, should there be a cap on how much money goes to BART, and then making sure that monies are distributed to all parts of the county with the new tax measure. So that was the driving force. It's difficult to predict how all of those mayors might respond to a revised allocation at this time.
Further questions of staff? Ms. Sayak?
So thank you for the clarification on the studies. I had heard different things about different studies. The question that I have is, if you look at our commute patterns now, it goes beyond Santa Clara County. I mean, unfortunately, we have people commuting hours, 2 hours. And has there any discussion been on looking beyond our county borders and actually looking at Santa Cruz and seeing all the residents that live in Santa Cruz now that are coming into the valley and how that affects the traffic for Los Gatos? I mean, that's just one specific instance that that affects us, may not affect North County, but it's a certain issue that our residents are concerned with on a daily basis.
So I was hoping you were going to go to the North Bay because it's easier that way. The MTC is responsible for the Bay Area, so that would be the responsible entity for the easy answer to the question. I think because Santa Cruz is a little bit separated, the studies and the review of that have been fewer. There are potential opportunities, I would imagine, for that, but the discussions have been very, very high level at this point.
Let me follow up with that, because it sort of circles to the same issue, which is this concept of region. We talk about a regional plan, or we talk about taxing, sales tax for regional transportation. But in reality, we have the beginning and ending of these this travel, not only in the Bay Area and Santa Cruz, but outside the Bay Area in the Central Valley. And so what thought, if any, has been given to the fact that we are looking at sales tax, we are looking at categories that are saying region, but are really ultra-regional?
So I think it's a good question and a good discussion point. I don't know that because the sales tax is implemented in this case, on a county-wide basis, I think really the focus has been on projects that affect the county. Certainly it rolls to the MTC, and they would be the entity that would pull that all together. There are definitely considerations for regional and even statewide considerations on how everything works together. I point to high-speed rail as being one of those considerations where that would potentially come through the Bay Area and connect to the counties and even to Southern California. So there are thoughts statewide on implementation of a plan that's even broader. Not something that I have been connected to, something that I think happens at the MTC level as a regional for us and potentially VTA.
Thank you. Further questions for Mr. Morley? Seeing none, thank you. If anyone wants to speak to us on this item, please submit a card. I do have one card. Carl Guardino. See, your timing was perfect.
Mayor and members of the council, thank you. My name is Carl Guardino. My address is 16060 Rose Avenue in Montecito, and I'm here tonight as CEO of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. It's a delight to continue the conversation we started in the study session as well. There are three major points I'd like to just mention and then be available to any questions you might like to ask. First is the positive news that I think we all recognize that we continue to need local funds for local transportation improvements with local transparency and accountability so that we can advance our economy and improve our quality of life. That's good news. That's a huge step. The second is that most of the categories, if you go back to the slide that Matt put up, most of the categories that you see are certainly the categories that we and our 400 members and the broad coalition with whom we've been working for well over 3 years, they're the same. And that's good because we're trying to build a system-wide approach for traffic relief, transportation options, and street maintenance and pothole repair. So the categories are very similar. Where we think there needs to be further refinement, and there's time for further refinement, is on dollar amounts that have been allocated. And I would just give a few examples as to why I think you need to think that through more before just passing something tonight. So something more along with recommendation D, or even looking at categories without dollar amounts tonight. And I'll give those examples. The one that you heard is this thought of a county-wide study where we believe what we should be looking at is a West Valley alternatives analysis. We've never heard of a county-wide alternatives analysis. That's not a normal term. But a West Valley alternatives analysis makes sure that those dollars would actually come back to the West Valley with the transit improvements identified in that analysis. So that is a shift from a $500 million allocation that you see there, where a dime, not even a dime, may ever come back to the West Valley, where we suggest $250 million just in local funds alone, where it's all for the West Valley and what those findings show. The county expressway number, the number that we have been suggesting for 3 years is $900 million. Why? Because this town, all 14 other cities and towns and the county spent years on the countywide expressway study. And the Tier 1 improvements in that study are very specific. It's $900 million. It's not $1 billion. The $900 million is what's needed on those 8 county expressways and Santa Teresa, which is like a mini expressway in Morgan Hill. The BART money that has been allocated here, we've asked about that because that is not the amount of money needed for a local match to draw down state funds of $750 million that we're seeking and federal funds of $1.5 billion that we're seeking. The number is 1.4. We do agree there should be a cap, by the way, and Supervisor Simitian has suggested 1.5 or 25% of the funds. That's what most people have been working on. This number is not only an inadequate amount for the local share, but it jeopardizes, therefore, the negotiations on a state share and a federal share in terms of matching funds. So again, the great news is most of the categories are the same. Most people recognize we need local funds to match state and federal funds, but I wouldn't rush with specific allocations tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. We've been working on this for 3+ years, so lots of data-driven analysis for any questions that you might have. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Questions? Ms. Sayak.
Mr. Gardino, I want to look at local streets and roads. You had mentioned the reasons why for the countywide study we should focus on West Valley because none of that money may actually come down to us. But the same argument could be said about local streets and roads. How do we ensure that we get any portion of that allocation?
The local streets and roads monies for street maintenance and pothole repair is actually done by formula, and it's a formula that we worked on in our 1996 successful transportation measure, and that's based on road miles and population. Now, we look to the public works directors that we've been meeting with now for over 3 years on this for their guidance. Does that need any tweaking? What is the normally acceptable practice, and I'm going to geek out on you a bit for a moment here, is 70% PCI, or 70% pavement condition index. That's the industry standard, if you will, for acceptable. It's not great, but it's acceptable. And what we did in 1996 and what we're recommending here from a leadership group perspective is if your community is acceptable, as the town of Los Gatos is, but the neighboring town of Montessorino is a little bit under that mark, then you're rewarded for that good behavior. You can use those funds for any traffic relief improvement that you as a council agree to. Or you could partner with neighboring jurisdictions through an MOU to do something even more sub-region wide with those funds, as long as you're maintaining that 70% or better in your pavement condition index. So it is actually a very specific amount. The deteriorating conditions of our roads have such an impact on travel of all types, whether bike and ped, whether buses or shuttle buses, whether cars, etc., that in what we think is a good plan, that's $1.2 billion. It's one of every $5 in a plan. And those funds are formula funds, again, based on your population and your road miles.
Let me follow up on that. Other than that analysis, which could bring funds into Los Gatos, is there anything else in that draft, but those draft potential categories, which could be specific to our town?
Yes.
Oh, and how?
Thank you. This is where I can't get in front of myself, or I am a former CEO. We have been working on this for over 3 years with the broader community and our member companies. And we have been tracking with the Envision Valley Transportation Authority process so that we could weigh in thoughtfully with data-driven analysis of what we would recommend. And we're still tracking in front of that process, but that process is still a few months away. So I'm speaking from a professional staff perspective as I answer this. And what we look at in terms of that category you see in streets and highways is a different amount. For the highway portion, mainly highway interchanges or fixing gap closures is a $700 million figure. And what we as staff think it should be included in that is what we call the waste problem here in Los Gatos and Montessorino. Our draft plan allocates $50 million just for that, continuing the conversation we had back in September, Councilmember Jensen, about what do we do about that? Well, mainly people are cutting off because we take Highway 17 from different amounts of lanes all the way down to 2, forcing people to think, well, Waze tells me if I get off at Lark or wherever, I'll just cut through all these nice, quiet neighborhoods. We want to fix that. We have a $50 million allocation just to how we fix 17 and 9 in those interchanges so that we keep people on the state highway rather than in our town and in our city. So that's one example of a difference in a finer level of detail that comes from 3 years of work rather than just broader categories.
Let me follow up on, thank you for reminding me. That widening of 17 from Lark to Highway 9 was specifically not selected by this council.
I know that.
And I know you're aware of that. So where did it come from? Because I know it's on some chart now.
Right, and again, it's a draft that hasn't been finalized, as I've mentioned. But over the last year and a half, what we've seen in terms of the impacts on this town and the neighboring communities based on the higher volumes is something that we believe needs to be addressed. But that just goes again to the further refinement that's needed. We are very close, I believe, to not only the same categories and the need for a measure, but what are the specifics in those categories? And rushing dollar amounts, I think, is just a little bit premature.
Thank you. Other questions? Seeing none? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for your time, and it's been a pleasure to work with your staff as well over 3 years now.
I have one other card. If anyone wants to address us on this item, please give me a card, and this is Lee Pennington.
Hi, I'm Lee Pennington, and I live at 135 Cali Margarita in Los Gatos. I appreciate all the work you do up here, and I appreciate Carl Guardino's statements. Very, very nice. Oh, sorry. I wasn't planning to be here. I'm so glad I found out this was on the agenda. Someone had wanted me to go to Campbell tonight because it was on the agenda there, and we just, anyway, connected. It's all good. So I just want to say that I hope that the town council goes very slowly with this decision to endorse the sales tax. It's an extremely important decision. The sales tax and the transportation issues in this valley, along with the environment, they go forever and ever for our children. This is to be taken very, very seriously. So personally, and also there's other people that aren't here tonight that feel the same way, but we can't endorse the sales tax. I think until we make sure that there's a concrete enforceable agreement that funds, I like the comprehensive West Valley Transportation Alternative Study or a countywide study. We can't endorse the sales tax unless the VTA honors the original 1990 approximately agreement with the town of Los Gatos and the other towns that said they would not add any lanes. We can't let any of this tax money go to added lanes when they haven't even addressed that they wouldn't do this without a permission. This is dishonorable in my mind. So until those things are cleared up, also that all environmental impact reports, number 3, are complete and taken care of. Already, Highway 85 alone is way over the decibel levels allowed many times for about 10 hours a day. It's not good. Those 3 things need to be addressed before one could endorse it, in my mind, and many other people's mind. This is a very important thing. Appreciate the 3 years of work. It's not easy. I wouldn't want to be in your position at all. But slow down and give it some thought. God bless.
Thank you. Questions? Seeing none, I don't have any other cards. Is there anybody in the audience who wishes to address us on this item? Seeing no one, I will end the public testimony portion of the public hearing, and I will look to the council for discussion, questions, motion. Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I want to start with a question or two, as my usual style. Maybe this is back to the town manager, but when this is created, I guess my question is, how much science is behind this and how arbitrary was it? We're kind of hearing from Mr. Gardino that they've been thinking about this and putting a lot of science and studies behind it for 3 years. Is any of that come here, or was this just horse trading amongst some people that haven't read the studies yet?
So let me start by just addressing the public speaker and clarify that there's nothing on the agenda today to endorse that or not endorse that was my second question. Tax measure. So I wanted to jump into that right away while it was fresh. So that's something the council will hear at a later date. This is specific just to a draft potential, very deliberate wording categories for an allocation should a sales tax measure pass in the future. To your question on the allocations and how they came about, there has been a whole bunch of work that's happened over the last 3 years, and through that work, there's been many discussions on what the dollar amounts that would come out of a sales tax. It started as a quarter cent, morphed to a half cent. There was discussions about fast tracking it to a ballot last year to try and get it through earlier. And all of that resulted in the preliminary discussion on allocations. Those have morphed over time, and that's where this information comes from, is just the working group discussions on what the allocations should look like, and that fed into the data largely. The information that has been added to this line is the line 3, and then the adjustment of some other areas that Mr. Gardino touched on, such as a reduction in the BART item and not including an item for mass transit for elderly and disabled.
If I could follow up a little bit.
Mr. Rennie?
So, in danger of asking you to call Mr. Gardino a liar, he's telling us that at 1.2, they can't make BART go. They can't get the matching funds. So that sounds like a pretty definite science, but you told me that they've applied science to this and they went ahead and ignored what, either that or they've got different science. So is it different science, or have they ignored it?
So I think the mayors and the managers, when they went through this list, came up with what they thought was a solution that could meet some of our additional needs while capping BART. The two big focuses there: bring some of the funding to a county-wide solution, a scenario that would relieve traffic county-wide, and also provide some dollars for future implementation of those projects, and also to reduce the contribution to BART, knowing full well that what the allocations were for BART and what the needs are there, I would suspect some understanding that there may be additional dollars out there, or that the project would need to be reduced in scope.
Ms. Pravetti?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would just like to offer that the allocation that is before you was prepared by the City of Mountain View as the starting point for the conversation. We never really discussed the source of the data. I think it was best professional understanding based on the work that the Public Works directors were, but finding money for the study and to have a placeholder of $500 million for any results from the study was really the core of what the North and West Valley mayors and managers were looking for.
Further questions? Mr. Rennie?
Address the noise one. So, Mrs. Bennington believes that noise is exceeded frequently. You told us earlier during the study session that it's not been exceeded, and so we haven't qualified for any noise reduction. Expand on that at all? Why is there...
Mr. Rennie, your mic isn't on.
Sorry. Shall I repeat it? Yes.
Yes, please.
Let me repeat my question. So earlier during the study session, you told us that the noise in the Los Gatos section on 85 is not exceeded, so we were not put forward for any noise reduction projects, but our earlier speaker, Mrs. Pennington, believed that it's frequently exceeded. So I'm trying to understand where the gap is here.
So I believe that the noise levels are exceeded on the 85 corridor, that being from San Jose in the south to Cupertino in the north, and that's where the noise study identifies issues. I read through the document myself on the noise study for the Los Gatos portions. The sensors that are in place don't show, in the information that was provided, don't show an excessive amount of noise above what it was forecast to be through the environmental documents originally.
Further questions? Thank you.
Tonight, from us.
So it is dynamic, it is moving. The meetings with the mayor's group are fairly frequent, so and the timeline is short with an August ultimate decision timeframe. So it's moving fairly quickly in terms of typical projects that we work on. We did provide some recommendation and alternatives to the recommendation. The idea behind the endorsing and providing some ability for the mayor and the manager to advocate for the town, provide some flexibility there, and if you were to endorse it and provide some guidelines on where you wanted the mayor and the manager to explore different allocations, that might be beneficial. Certainly, as a member of the TAC, having definition on what the allocation would be from a preferred allocation for the town would be helpful for me as we continue to work towards completing this ballot measure.
Thank you, Mr. Morley. No question, but just to weigh in on this, a couple of things that have come up. Somebody mentioned endorsing the tax measure and whether the allocation endorses a tax measure. It doesn't on its face, but by implication, if you're spending tax money, you are by implication endorsing a tax measure. And what the mayors are doing, because it is true, we've had several people up here attending the North County West Valley meeting. But what I observed is that there was, in effect, negotiations amongst those line items so that the city or region could have more monies in its little box than the other monies, starting with BART and working down from there. The reason I put this on the agenda was to get guidance from this council. We have so much going on, it's overlapping, it's intertwining, and I don't want to go to a meeting with just my own perspective and make decisions the way I personally feel. I want to give input that reflects a majority or all of this council. So that's what I'm looking for. Ms. Jensen.
Well, with that in mind, if you're looking for input, my input, having been to these meetings before, having been to the Policy Advisory Committee many, many times, having been to the Route 85 Committee many times, which is continuing, by the way. Next meets on February 22nd. I think I agree with Mr. Guardino. I think it's premature for this council to adopt or endorse any allocation of funds, which may or may not be available, depending on whether or not there is a ballot measure and depending upon whether or not it's successful. Just my experience in the mayor's meetings is the mayors, as they should be, are absolutely, completely advocates for their city. And so, to Mr. Rennie's question, is there horse trading? Well, not so much as pounding on the table and saying that I want X, but there's a lot of, I'm sure, polling, research, et cetera, that is going to go into whatever ultimately goes on, if whatever ballot measure there may not be. And there are parallel tracks with all of these committees that are all having input into how this works or how you want funds spent. So my input is we should absolutely not. We should wait to see how those things play out. We should get as much information as we can, and then we should figure out where we want to go as a council, and we should trust our mayor and the other representatives that we have on these other committees to act in the best interest of Los Gatos.
Thank you. Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I guess I have two separate things. I'll do the first one. So what I would do is, again, not adopt these specific numbers. I might say, and maybe we just give our opinions versus actually vote on something, but the format of this seems reasonable. The exact allocations, we don't know if they're right or not. I don't like the idea of shortchanging BART, so I would say definitely leave. I'd want to see that negotiated up. We've got suggestions to maybe change this around to make sure that the West Valley Corridor make sure that it gets money. That seems to be a strong suggestion. So those are more the kinds of direction I would want to give versus something hard and fast on, each of these numbers, for example. And then the second thing, if I could, I noticed in our packet there was something in attachment 2 called the Guiding Principles of the North and West Valley Cities. I really liked those guiding principles. Is that something that would be helpful for this council to endorse?
I think you're sending a question to me. And right now, what I'm looking for is anything that this council wants to give input to me and to whomever is representing you on these various bodies. I personally will be listening to everything you all say. Motions with 3 votes or more would be even better. Yes, Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. When I look at this proposed tax measure, I'm primarily concerned with what we can do for Los Gatos. I am particularly interested within our community, only in our transportation, parking, infrastructure needs. I'm not concerned about outside of the community, things like BART, and I'm not, in principle, someone who supports raising taxes in general. I think 9.25% sales tax is high, so I'm sharing my personal opinion. That's not necessarily the opinion of others, but I am concerned that if we were going to move forward with some kind of a tax hike, that why wouldn't we go about doing that on our own to support our own $70 million within our own community? I understand the importance of regional transportation, and our Los Gatos residents may use those transportation arterials or resources and such, but when you look at the amount of dollars being proposed over the 30 years and where the majority of those dollars are going, it's outside of our community and it's essentially outside of our control. So I like the control and the dollars to stay in our community as much as possible.
Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I have a little bit different opinion. I think that the transportation outside of our community is affecting our community quite a bit. The beach traffic, you'll see a lot of traffic come down 17 and go up Route 9 instead of taking 85. So the fact that our freeways around us are having a very, very, very significant effect on Los Gatos. So I realize we want to fix our potholes and so forth, but I would also want to make sure we're making real investments for improvements in the future. I'd want to make sure that a good portion of dollars are going to, like a rail or some, whatever the right solution is for real improvements.
Further discussion? or a motion? Ms. Sayak?
I'll take a stab at a motion based on what I'm hearing tonight. I move that we do not endorse the allocation at this time, and that we give discretion to the mayor and town manager to advocate for the town's position, and that the town's position is in keeping with the goals and strategies as contained in Attachment 5, but also the strategies and goals that we've articulated in our general plan, as well as our work plans for the next following years. We have made it a priority to look at ways to keep regional traffic on freeways so that they do not cut through our towns and impact the daily lives of our residential streets. We are looking at ways to upgrade our pedestrian and bicycle mobility projects. So any improvements in that regard we would support. And also, we would not want to do anything that would in any way harm the community that is adjacent to Highway 85, and that we are looking at what those studies are studying, and that we are ensuring that we don't basically tie our hands one way or another. We're not endorsing a sales tax measure at this time, but we are continuing the discussion, and we are continuing to gather information so that when it's the appropriate time, we make a decision that is best for Los Gatos.
Second. Okay, we have a motion and a second. I was going to get some clarification. The one thing that you said, consistent with Exhibit 5.
Excuse me, Attachment 5. So these were the goals and strategies that were contained in our study session packet. Enhance safety, provide congestion relief, expand transportation choices, expand transit ridership. Those were the larger goals, and it had some subsets of that.
All right, thank you. That clarifies it. We have a motion and a second. Discussion.
It wasn't a question. I withdraw my hand.
Do you still second the motion?
I was going to summarize what I was seconding, but I think it's fine.
All right. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you, council, and thank you, staff. And I'm also going to, on behalf of the council and myself, just confirm with the town manager that as decisions are made in which Los Gatos is involved or represented, that those decisions or input will be forwarded to the entire council, at least as part of manager matters.
Yes, manager matters and our weekly memo we'll use as the appropriate vehicle to make sure you are kept current on these issues.
Thank you. All right, we are now on agenda item 3.2, Hillside Development Standards and Guideline Modifications, applicant Town of Los Gatos. So I'm assuming that you will be making the report.
That's correct. Good evening, Mayor and council members. The Hillside Development Standards and Guidelines were adopted by the Town Council in January of 2004. Staff was directed by the Town Council to prepare amendments to Chapter 2, Constraints Analysis and Site Selection, and Chapter 5, Architectural Design, for consideration with the intent that further clarification would provide assistance to applicants, the deciding bodies, and staff regarding visibility, light reflectivity, and determining compliance with the Hillside Standards and Guidelines. The proposed amendments to Chapter 2 and Chapter 5 went before the Planning Commission on 3 separate occasions on September 23rd, October 21st, and December 2nd. There was ample public involvement during the Planning Commission meeting, study session, and special meeting, in addition to staff's involvement, meeting with members of the public outside of the Planning Commission meetings. After full consideration of the amendments, the Planning Commission is recommending that the Council adopt the proposed amendments to Chapters 2 and 5. The Planning Commission recommendation can be found in Exhibit A and Exhibit B of Attachment 11. Staff is also recommending that the Town Council adopt the resolution in Attachment 11 to amend Chapter 2 and Chapter 5 of the document. Alternative options are provided for the Council's consideration in page 4 of the staff report. Lastly, there is an addendum and desk item before you this evening, which contain public comments and provides staff's response to 2 council member questions. This completes staff's presentation, and we are available for any questions.
Questions of staff? I was debating whether or not to ask this at the end or ask it now, but I think I'll start now. What I'm looking at is one of the attachments, and I don't know what its number or letter is. But my question is, as to each of these issues, were they decided upon by the Planning Commission, as opposed to just discussed by the Planning Commission? So did the Planning Commission make any decisions with regard to native trees being the ones that are examined or looked at for screening?
So those, I think you're referring to Attachment 14, where staff provided additional responses to those 8 items. And so of the 8 items, 6 of them were discussed at the December 2nd meeting. However, the Planning Commission did not include any of them in their motion. Only items number 3 and 7 with regards to a maintenance agreement, and then to tree pruning. Those 2 items were not brought before the Planning Commission on December 2nd for their consideration.
All right, so I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, because right now I don't know what the number of my exhibit here is. So the Planning Commission made no decision on native trees?
Correct.
Made no decision on on-site trees?
Pardon me, could you repeat that?
On-site trees? I'm sorry, maybe.
So they didn't go through each of these specifically. They were grouped together, and they were discussed as a group and just not included in their motion.
All right, thank you. Any other questions of staff? Mr. Rennie?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. David sent us their suggestion for addition, so my question was whether this was ever, I did read through the Planning Commission, the last meeting they had, their minutes, but they're made a suggestion that sounds quite good, so I'm wondering why, basically what they're saying, I'll read it. Applicants are encouraged to provide native screen trees. These trees will require a deed restriction for their preservation and protection. The canopy of the tree at the time of the visibility analysis shall be allowed to be used as screening. This seems to make a lot of sense to me, effectively allowing them to plant trees and use whatever of the tree they planted, use that screening as part of the analysis. So to me, it seems like it's encouraging the planting of even native trees and requiring a deed restriction. So was anything like this discussed with the Planning Commission?
So the specific language they provided was not brought before the Planning Commission.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions of staff? Seeing none, thank you. I do have cards. If anybody else wants to speak on this, please submit a card. First one is Dan Hale.
I also have something to pass out, if I may.
Give any materials to staff, and also you're going to need to bring the mic up closer to you. Thank you.
Good evening. Dan Hale with Hunt Hale Jones Architects. Pleasure to be in front of the council tonight and to speak on this matter. I am currently working with Summerhill Homes on the Prospect Avenue project. But also in the past, I've been fortunate enough to work in your community doing some remodels and additions and working on some individual homes. So I'm familiar with not only your town design guidelines, but the hillside design guidelines. And I'm here mainly to speak in support of averaging, the concept of averaging the colors to a 30% but including the roof material as part of the overall calculation. Roofs are typically a pretty prominent aspect of most homes. And as a designer, I like to think of the entire color palette and how it works together, and to be able to have the flexibility to get colors that work together and complement one another. And I think if you have the opportunity to average the roofs with the overall colors and materials on the home, it gives designers more flexibility in that regard. What I've passed around are a couple of actual color samples. And this is an example of two typical color swatches out of a Cullimore color book. And what it shows you is that to stay within a maximum LRV of 30, you're really working with the bottom three colors on that list. And those are the colors that I passed around. So if you cannot use a color that's higher than 30, I really think it leads to pretty mundane, dark, lifeless architecture, to be honest with you. To support my opinion of the idea of averaging and what I think it can do is it provides contrast to the architecture. I think contrast allows you to highlight certain architectural features. It might be a railing, it might be a column, it might be a feature in the gable element. I think that it improves the architecture of the individual home and improves the architecture of the neighborhood and of the community. In this particular instance, the actual average of those homes actually would probably be a little bit high, but I wanted to give it as an example of contrast and how it can provide interest to the architecture. These are two examples that I think would meet the averaging aspect. There's dark body colors, but there's some lighter trims on the house on the left, or the right, excuse me, to provide interest. The home on the upper left has a lot of masonry with darker colors. You can go a little bit lighter on the body color. Again, it's the interest and the variety in the architecture that colors, you can apply with colors and improve the overall look in the community. So again, I would support averaging and including the roof materials with the overall average. One last quick comment.
Well, right now, that's it.
I'd be happy to answer questions.
Okay. Do we have questions? Ms. Jensen?
Thank you. Mr. Hale, I'm curious about your advocacy for including a roof in the averaging. So when I hear that, what I think is I could have a white marble house that stepped on a hillside for 30 feet with a black roof on it and qualify. And I, for one, would not be interested in allowing that to happen. Is that what you have in mind? Not the white house with the black roof, I hope, but do you have in mind that the square footage of a roof would be included in the average that would therefore sort of negate, the stepping down of the hillside? Because I'm not looking at the roof when I'm looking up at the house.
I understand your question. I believe I understand how you came about that. But because the amount of area of the roof is so large, combined with typical wall features, you're not going to be able to get a huge contrast and still meet the average. It would throw the skew off on the weighted average of the two. But being limited to a 30% max on roof materials limits me as a designer about what I can actually pick. There's very few selections that are only 30% max. So you might go up to a 27 or a 28 and gives you a little more variety in what you're able to do with the roof materials.
Mr. Rennie?
Thank you, Mayor Spector. If I could follow up on Mrs. Jensen's comment. So do you really want the roof included so that you can average down the walls, or you want to be able to go above a 30 on the roof and then maybe have the walls bring the average down?
It could work either way, but I don't think that when you got into running the calculations, you're going to be this far apart because the roof materials, one, typically don't get that light. But it does give you more flexibility in selecting different colors on roofs. You can have a darker roof, maybe go to a 27 on the body color versus a 30. You can see the 30 is. May I change the slide again?
Sure.
By going to a slightly darker roof, you may be able to go up one color on that chart past the 30% line. You're never going to be able to get really light on the body colors. The numbers just won't work. We had some time to investigate this after our last meeting. I also spoke at the Planning Commission meeting. And there was a discussion about which way would be better. And when we looked at the opportunities that were available to us with different roofs, different roof materials, different colors, we thought it would provide better architecture to bring the two together.
Mr. Rennie?
Maybe if I could follow up. So I'm thinking through this a little bit. I don't know the answer, but I'm assuming that you get to use the entire square footage of the roof, even though a good portion of it's facing up. What if that's the way it is calculated, what if we then only allowed you to use the portion of the roof that, that percentage that was actually kind of at an eye level or in the horizontal plane, let's say?
Staff maybe can answer it more specifically, but when we did the calculations, we were looking at a two-dimensional elevation and only looking at not the actual horizontal, but the two-dimensional aspect, and each elevation is taken separately. So, and then it has to be averaged as a whole.
So you're doing basically what I suggested
Yes.
already. Okay, thank you.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Lee Quintana?
Lee Quintana. Excuse me. I would recommend that you return this to staff for additional work. There seems to be a lot of questions and items that have been brought up by various people, and I think it could maybe benefit from some more consideration. I do have 3 things that I would like to suggest that be included in further discussion or in. One is to change the language where it refers to community director making decisions and add or deciding bodies so that it's clear that, well, anyway, in my mind, that the deciding bodies still have the option of suggesting something different, should they not agree. The second is to consider that vegetation that is removed due to fire safety considerations not be included in the screening. That was not considered before, and the reason I bring that up now is that I realize that we've been talking about trees all along, but we're really talking about the trees that are identified as subject to the town's tree protection ordinance, and there is the possibility of trees on the site that are less than that do provide some screening that if taken away because of fire safety considerations, would make the site more visible. And thirdly, consideration of visibility from Highway 17, which is one of the biggest views of our hillsides. And fourth, that I know that language has been added regarding deed restrictions. However, I think there's a difference between how a deed restriction functions versus how a maintenance agreement functions, and seems that a maintenance agreement would be maybe more, have more ability to be enforced.
Thank you. Questions from Ms. Quintana? Thank you. Dave Wiseman?
Dave Weissman, Francis Oaks. I'd like to address your attention to page 1 of today's desk item. According to staff, there were 8 items in our packet spreadsheet. Staff says that 6 of these items were discussed by the Planning Commission but not passed on to the Town Council. Because that statement is totally inaccurate, I want to speak to each of these items, and especially to Mayor Spector, because she had these questions. Number 1, only trees native to the immediate area should be counted as screening. That was not specifically included in the motion, but all the discussions we had were about oak trees, which are all native. The town's consulting arborist was brought in to the Planning Commission. She was only asked questions about the oak trees. It's an omission, and it should be corrected. But clearly, all efforts were discussed were native trees. And in addition, the recently revised tree protection ordinance is now encouraging the removal of non-native trees from the hillside. Number 2, only trees on site should be counted as screening. That item was included in staff reports for the first 2 planning commissions to be talked about. For some reason, it was dropped from the 3rd planning commission meeting, and that's when those items were talked about. That was an oversight on staff's part. And the same thing is with item 6, trees harmed during construction, were originally on the staff agenda for the first 2 planning commission meetings, but we never got to them. And they were not talked about at the 3rd planning commission meeting when all of these issues were considered in motion. Number 3, tree maintenance agreement. Ms. Quintana just talked about that. I think that's an extra safety factor. We're not going to have people going into people's backyards to see. But if it impresses upon the homeowner, if you have a maintenance agreement, then you've got to take a little better care of it. Number 5, provide a percentage of screening trees with sparse canopies. During the motion, Kendra asked staff, she thought that it was already being done, that sparse canopies were being considered by the staff. Staff said, yes, we do that. That is totally inaccurate. That's why that was not included in the motion, because staff told the Planning Commission that that's already being done. 6 I've already addressed. That was supposed to be addressed. That was in the staff agenda, but it didn't make it into the last one. Removing vegetation from a tree should not be counted as screening. We specifically said if it's less than 25%, then that tree can be counted as screening. But the tree protection ordinance says that you need a permit if you're going to remove more than 25%. And it seems to me if you need to remove more than 25% for the house, then that tree should not be counted as screening. So my recommendation is that this be referred back to staff. This is not ready for prime time. It needs more work. We can fix it up. It's been 12 years since we last dealt with these issues. Let's get it right this time.
Thank you. Questions? Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Dr. Weissman, so, I saw you, met with you and talked with you on these items before, and as I thought about it, a couple of them I started to not make sense to me after a while. Some of your issues were the impact of construction on a tree and whether there was mechanical injury on a tree. It seems to me these things are covered by the deed restriction. I mean, we're worried about, okay, we've used this tree for screening, and then in the process of construction they damage the tree, and then it's going to die in some amount of time. Well, if it dies, the deed restriction says it has to be replaced. So why is that really so important?
It's important because most of the mechanical injuries that happen to these trees are happening to them before construction, before the projects are approved. And those mechanical injuries are happening because the developer is not putting up the required tree protection fencing, which they're supposed to put up before they do anything on the property. So there is an injury to the tree, but the tree is still viable at the time the application comes forward. The tree is counted as screening, and then 6 months, a year, 2 years later, that tree dies. And if it's a big tree, we all acknowledge that you're not going to replace a 25-foot tree with a 25-foot tree. You just can't move trees that big around and transplant them. So what are you going to do? They're going to put in a much smaller tree, and the screening that was there at the time of the A&S application is now gone. By penalizing the developer for not protecting the tree like they're supposed to, like they're required to, I think is an incentive for the developer to take good care of these trees from the get-go.
That's clear. Thank you.
Other questions? Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Dr. Wiseman, you mentioned two things. You said, I think, you recommend sending it back to Planning Commission, or you said sending it back to staff?
I'm sorry,
for further
to
review?
staff. To staff.
Okay, that's what you
I'm sorry if I misspoke.
Thank you.
Ms. Syak.
So your suggestion number 3, add tree maintenance agreement, can you walk me through why that differs from a deed restriction?
Say you've got, theoretically, they could be the same. But I think by having both of them, you are telling the homeowner that this tree is important to the town, that you've got a deed restriction on it for in perpetuity, but also you have a 5-year maintenance agreement, which I've pulled out of the tree protection ordinance. If trees have to be planted because as replacement trees, we now require them to sign a 5-year maintenance agreement. So with that maintenance agreement, somebody that's in charge of that, whether it's a tree consulting arborist, will actually have permission to go into their backyard and look at that tree and say, it's doing well. If you sign a deed restriction and the tree is in the backyard, no one's got permission to go into that backyard. Sure, it's there, it's in the deed, but I just think this is an extra layer of surveillance, which I think could be effective. And again, impress upon people we're serious about this. I think these homeowners, if these are screening trees, they're going to want these trees to die, because when they die, it improves their view.
I see no other questions. Thank you very much. Steve Abbs.
Hi, good evening, Mayor, council members. I'm Steve Abbs with David on Homes. One thing that the staff report failed to point out was that this whole conversation regarding visibility actually stemmed from the Highlands of Los Gatos Lot 7 appeal that happened on May 19th, 2015. And if you recall in that hearing, council remanded that application back to Planning Commission to make some minor adjustments, but also to staff was to provide some additional clarification to the methodology of the visual analysis. And basically for only two points that you guys were concerned about. And one was the viewing platforms, and the other one was making sure that the trees that were being proposed to be removed or impacted by construction was not being included in the screening of the visual analysis. So 8.5 months later, the discussion obviously expanded from those two items to multiple items. In fact, I think staff and Planning Commission did a great job in thoroughly looking at all the subjects that Mr. Weissman and Ms. Cantata just brought up, and that's evidenced by the 3-inch staff report and all the attachments along with it. So we're hoping that this issue finally gets resolved so we can move forward with our applications. Last week, I did submit a letter requesting additional language to be included regarding planted screen trees. And I'd like to give you a couple scenarios where it just makes sense that planted screen trees should be allowed. Scenario is that the applicant begins design with a screen tree in fair or fair good condition. 1 year later, prior to the DRC hearing, staff requires an updated arborist report. And that tree is downgraded to a fair poor or poor condition tree. Now, is it fair that that applicant should start design all over? Or should the applicant have the opportunity to replace that tree with a healthy tree and be used for screening? The second scenario is if a tree is located where it provides its screening in its deemed poor or fair poor condition, and if that applicant chooses to replace that tree with a healthy tree that would be protected by a deed restriction, wouldn't that make more sense than leaving the poor condition tree in place with no deed restriction, and so when it dies, no replacement is required? So it just seems like the applicant should have that option. So all three of those scenarios only benefit the struggling oak woodland in the environment by planting new trees, and it just makes sense to be allowed. But the current town practices do not allow planted trees to be used as screening in the visual analysis. So I request that council approve these recommendations that set forth by Planning Commission with the addition of some language that is fair to the applicant where screen trees may be allowed in cases as deemed appropriate by the Community Development Director. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Questions? Ms. Syak?
You gave 2 scenarios. I lost you on your second scenario.
Okay. So this is related directly to our Lot 7 that you guys reviewed. There's 2 trees that are being used for screening on that site that are in fair poor condition. And those trees are basically not, per the recommendations by Planning Commission, are not to be allowed for screening. As an applicant, we should have an option to replace that tree if we want to spend the money and put a brand new healthy tree. We can, there's big box trees that you can put in. There's multiple trees that you can put in. But an applicant should have the option to put healthy, native, evergreen coast live oaks in place that will only grow over time and provide more screening over time. And that will have a deed restriction on it. But if we just leave those trees in place, there's no deed restriction required because they're not providing screening because they're in fair, poor condition. And so if that tree dies, you have a wide open sky there. And, so to me, it just makes sense. Let the applicants plant more trees in this struggling oak woodland. It's just a benefit to everyone.
Let me follow up on that. The question goes to size. There are fair or poor trees, and you're saying give us the opportunity to replace them with healthy trees. That sounds like a good thing. But what size? I mean, let's say your fair or poor tree is really big. Are you going to put in a really big replacement tree, or is there going to be a tree that over years becomes a large tree?
Well, I think that should be up to the applicant, because if no tree is planted there, that tree is not used for screening. So if the applicant chooses to plant a 24-inch box, which is only 6 feet tall, at the time of the visual analysis, the canopy will be the only credit it'll get. But if the applicant wants to spend $30,000 on putting a 25-foot box tree in, 25-foot tall, with a canopy of 15, 20 feet, you should have that option, and that canopy should be used for screening in the visual analysis.
Thank you. Other questions? Ms. Jensen.
Sir, our current hillside guidelines have a provision that says providing landscape screening is not an alternative to reducing building height or selecting a less visible site. So I read that as screening cannot be a cure for a house that's too big or a house that's sited incorrectly. And what I'm hearing you suggest is that, well, if I plant some trees, I can get a bigger house, et cetera. And is that what I'm hearing, that I'll plant trees before I build the house, and therefore I can site it differently or make it bigger? Or are you suggesting that if one of the trees that I've got in the plan that's approved that is otherwise appropriate dies, I have the option of replacing it with a native tree?
Yeah, I think the two scenarios I gave to you were the fact that if there was a poor tree, conditioned tree on the site that has basically deemed by Planning Commission or by these recommendations have no value of screening, they're going to die. What I'm asking is that those trees should be able to be replaced by healthy trees.
Okay, that was scenario number one.
Okay.
That's fine.
and-
What I'm concerned about is your second scenario where you say the applicant has the option to plant very large trees, and they should have the choice to do that. And I'm trying to figure out, well, do you want to plant them before the fact so that you come in with your plan with a big house that's not cited per the guidelines and say, well, I've got big trees because I planted them myself? And I would say that would be in violation of our guidelines because screening can't cure that problem. Or do you want to say, well, if I wanted to enhance the oak population of my lot, I could plant a tree after I had an approved house?
So I would propose that tree to be replaced with would not exceed the tree that exists, so that no additional screening would be there to screen the house any further than what's there now. So basically, if it's a 30-foot tall tree with a 30-foot size canopy, if it's a poor condition tree, it's already an existing canopy out there, right? So if the applicant wants to come back and replace that poor condition tree with a brand new healthy 30-foot diameter canopy, that's going to survive several decades. To me, that makes sense. I mean,
so that's post-approval of an otherwise acceptable project per our hillside design guidelines is what you're proposing. Post-approval, not pre-approval.
Well, no, I would suggest that it be pre-approval. And that visual analysis use that tree that's been placed.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, sir. Sandy Decker?
Sandy Decker, 45 Glen Ridge. Good evening, worthy and willing participants in the planning at the town council. Can I ask you to put that on for me? First of all, thank you very much, Mrs. Jensen. I think you hit it. We've been fighting this game for so many years. Hillsides are so important to this town. And the idea of deciding that we are going to approve something is as it is, putting a 24 to a 36-inch box tree in because you are thinking surely as the developer that this is really a tree that's going to die, so I'm going to put a new one in here, and then I'm going to bring in my proposal. You can count on that tree dying. They're too big. They have to go through the construction process. Very few trees that big live because they have been sitting so long to grow in a box, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. I would like to speak in favor of reducing the percentage of hillside visibility of a proposed structure from 25% to 15%. If we accept 25% visibility of a structure from a viewing platform at the story pole stage, we are on a slippery slope, no pun intended. As construction begins, grading the site, stripping the site, basement excavation is done by people who don't read our ordinances or care, and this is where the trouble starts. By the time the building is erected, it is often beyond 25% visibility, due many, many times to loss of vegetation. This picture is a perfect example of finished construction. This is 25% of finished construction, visible by the naked eye from Los Gatos Boulevard. Hopefully, you have visited sites as council members where destruction has occurred. It is so obvious that at this point, there is no way to repair the damage that was done. I would also like to talk about viewing corridors at some point, but I probably don't have that time. But I will take what I do have to say that there are other areas, one that I would like to offer up, and it's where I live on Glen Ridge, which views this town almost in totality. I knew you would get me. So that's what I have to say. I would love to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you. Questions? Ms. Jensen.
Ms. Decker, thank you. I have a question about viewing platforms. And the current hillside design, I forget what they're called, design guidelines, whatever they're called, development guidelines, designate 1, 2, 3, 4 viewing platforms, corner of Los Gatos Boulevard and Blossom Hill, for example. And then it says others as may be determined. And so I'm curious about your opinion on whether it's appropriate to have a designated platform, i.e. I'm going to go stand at that corner in a particular place and take a picture, or would it be more appropriate to have a defined corridor where I am going to look from certain areas in the town that's not necessarily at the Chevron gas station?
I would love to see that happen. I don't think at this point our viewing platforms are really that effective. There's nothing going on from my side of town except Bayview and Santa Cruz Avenue, I believe. And at that point, it's very difficult to see the real impact of what you're seeing by houses that are being built in the hillsides. From Glen Ridge, you can see every white house that's up there. You can see, as you can, every white roof. I don't care what percentage you're talking about. Those houses glare and reflect. And, we just don't have the people that are going out there and doing what we need to do on controlling some of these things. In my whole many, many years of service to the town, I've never known of one person who has repainted a house in our hillside, for instance. But it's difficult to see if you're sitting, at Bayview Avenue and Santa Cruz. And so I would really love to see corridors, and I would really like to see this given back to either staff or the Planning Commission to review. Let's get it right this time, okay?
Further questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Ms. Decker. This is my last card, so if you want to talk, hand in a card. Looks like Dennis Rosari.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, Dennis Rosari, David on Homes. I wanted to respond to a comment that was made by Councilman Rainey regarding a question to staff on the deed restrictions on mitigation and tree planting that actually have been brought up at Planning Commission level, with all due respect to staff, by both Mr. Abbs and myself on more than one occasion. And as discussed by Mr. Abbs, we do think that there is value to mitigation planting. Not only did David move large trees in excess of 25 feet on site, but the prior developer did as well. Many of those trees are still surviving and are growing. So we think that while this is a secondary growth forest that is out there that is in a declining state, there is great value to adding mitigation planting to replenish this forest, both in moderate-sized planting from 24-inch boxes up to larger native trees that can be imported and brought into the site that are healthy and vigorous and will continue to grow. The other part of this, we believe, is we think Planning Commission and staff have done a great job in preparing this and bringing it back to you for recommendations. We have 4 applications that are pending and on our hold, waiting for a decision on this to allow us to move forward. The slide that was last up on the screen that was brought up by the previous speaker was of Lot 6, which has received a lot of attention over the past number of months and on these hearings, as well as at the council level, on the visibility. David prepared through our architects an analysis on that house. After that house was constructed, the homeowner requested a tree to be removed on the back of the house. With that tree, it was a very large native tree, and permission was granted for that tree to be removed. With that tree removed, that house, in its current picture on this wall, is only 23% visible with the analysis that was done. There's a large portion of that house, a whole story, that is below the canopy of those trees. That is a 2-story rear elevation of that house. Now, you may not agree that it's appropriately sized for the hill or what have you, but it is 23% visibility. It was less visible before the large oak tree was removed with permission of the town. So we do believe that the proposal before you tonight does work. We also strongly believe what you have been using for the last 12-plus years, I believe it is, has worked, and has worked well. And not only does the A&S review have discretionary approval, but so does Planning Commission, and so does Council. You have the right to deny any application that comes before you for whatever reason, whether it be visibility analysis, whether the house is too large. We have 4 applications pending. We would urge you to take action on this tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Questions? Ms. Sayak.
So we can use this as a case study of sorts. The oak tree that was removed, was it used when you brought forward your application as a screening tree?
Staff did not require visual analysis on a percent coverage for this house at the time it went through A&S, but the tree was a large canopy tree massing a good portion of the back of the house. It was in the center of the house, and a large portion of the roof probably was not visible. I apologize, I don't have a slide.
Okay, so because it didn't, because it was less than 25% at the time of application, you didn't have to go through the methodology of providing what trees provided screening?
That's correct.
Okay.
Currently, it's at 23%. With the larger oak that was removed, it was well below the 25, well below the 23%.
And it was removed, and it was approved with removal by our town staff?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you. I have no other cards. Does anyone else want to address us on this agenda item? Seeing no one coming forward, I will close the public testimony of this hearing and look to the council for questions, discussion, or motion. Ms. Jensen.
Okay, I'll try a motion. My motion would be to actually return this to staff, and I'll give some specific direction regarding that. First, I want to say that I really, really, really appreciate all the work that the Planning Commission has done on this issue, having all the meetings and carefully reviewed all of the discussion that they had. It was very helpful, so thank you, Planning Commission. So as I look at what is being proposed, and as somebody that way back when in the Dark Ages actually worked on these existing guidelines, I have a couple of problems. Some are big picture items. So for example, in the proposed changes, there are asterisks instead of including substantive language in the guidelines. And I just actually think that's a terrible way to draft something. So if it's important enough to be included, it should be incorporated into the document. Secondly, there should be consistency throughout the document in how things are described. So, for example, there's something that's paragraph B, which is called, quote, view analysis, unquote. And then it goes down and it talks about view analysis. And then later on, we've got visibility analysis. So what is it? We really need to understand what it is that we're talking about. And it's interesting with all the discussion that we're having about screening, because that's not contained in the guidelines anywhere, at least that I could find. So when I was thinking through this, I thought, well, screening is really a component of whatever this visibility analysis is. And I think that what Ms. Quintana and Dr. Weissman are asking for is to incorporate a more specific visual analysis or visibility analysis into our documents so that we all know what we're talking about. So that would include, for example, if you're going to replace a tree, it has to be a native tree. So I think of the house that if you are driving out of Los Gatos down Blossom Hill toward Union, you can look up on the hillside to the right and there's a line of Italian cypresses that are stuck in front of a house, which makes zero sense. And so it absolutely has to be incorporated into our guidelines that I can't plant a palm tree, or if there's a palm tree there, God forbid that I should put one back. But so we have to be very specific about that, and we need to be specific. That Lot 6 is a great example of why a maintenance agreement makes sense, Because if I am the homeowner and I come in and I decide that that tree is no good for whatever reason, and I can, after approval, I realize this was different, but come in and have a giant tree removed, then there needs to be an incentive for me to be able to maintain that tree if it's valuable to the town. So, and in order to spread the pain and responsibility of that, if there's something where there's a development that's kind of has CC&Rs and a homeowners association, I could see where that could be spread across a homeowners association and say these are the responsibility of that development actually. And so I would like to see something like that be incorporated into how this gets defined. So for example, we say, quote, potential for being visible, which is that's pretty broad. If trees or large shrubs are removed, significantly pruned or impacted by construction, well, that includes all of the screening issues that we've been talking about, but it's not contained, I think, in any way that's understandable. So that's why we get into these issues. I would also be in favor of the staff coming back to us with proposed language to not necessarily make a giant mile-wide view corridor, but I think it makes sense to have something that's a larger area than the specific, at this intersection, view platforms, because everybody who's been on the Council of Planning Commission knows that everybody stands behind the Chevron sign and takes a picture, and you can't see the house, and they say it's not visible. So, it's not good to play that game. So I'd like to see something that recognizes that there is a wider area from which you can look. And I noticed that the current viewing platforms actually do include the crossing of Highway 9 and 17, so I think there actually is something there. But it struck me that you could reduce there's another portion, section C, selecting the building site, and it says reduce visual impact. And it says providing landscape screening is not an alternative to reducing building height or selecting a less visible site. So the proposal that I'm going to plant a tree and then get it approved, I would not want to see in our guidelines. However, if you got it approved and a tree died, I would require that you replace that tree. So it struck me that we should look at it as screening would be the final consideration. The first is you site in the least restrictive development area. The second is the height and mass and site selection. And the third is the consideration of existing screening and how you're going to preserve that. So, and I would also include in my motion, well, I'm just going to stop there, and then we'll see if we get a second.
All right, thank you, Ms. Jensen. I'm going to go over this probably with Ms. Pravetti, and if I understand everything that you said, you probably have a second here. But let's make sure that we all have the same motion. That we're going to delete the asterisks, because if it's important enough to say, it's important enough to be in the body of the document. We're going to examine consistency in language, for example, the words view versus visibility. With regard to screening, we're going to, and let me stop there. If, Ms. Jensen, if some of this is wrong, please let me know. With regard to screening, we're going to include more specific analysis. That one I'm going to need more clarification. We want a maintenance agreement. We can look at view corridors, but not so narrowly, because I also know how you can stand behind the Chevron sign and not see the house. And then there were several items on the last aspect of your motion which I wasn't able to capture.
Okay, I will try to clarify. When I was talking about provide more analysis for screening, really what I was wanting to see was a more language that was more structured and detailed about what the visibility analysis included. Because what I don't see now, we've had a lot of discussion about screening, but if I go back and I look at the guidelines, it's not really in there per se. So it strikes me that that would be part of whatever language was developed for what was an appropriate visibility analysis, is what I had in mind with that. And on the last item, I was just going through my thought process pretty much. That wasn't really part of the what I was thinking about.
Oh, this was like existential?
Exactly, Zen motion making.
Okay. All right, we'll get rid of the existential. I will second the motion. I also want to commend the Planning Commission, the work they did and the passion they had in getting it right was very commendable. And the package, the product that they've given us makes life a lot easier for the council and for staff. I was having a little bit of difficulty, I think it was in their last meeting that they were doing this, because they would be discussing issues, but they wouldn't be making motions on issues. And so therefore, I was unable to determine for myself which issues raised by the speakers were captured in the ordinance and which were not. So that's the motion, has no existential component, and it's seconded. Discussion. Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. So there was a couple other things that were discussed in the Planning Commission that didn't end up in the motion that I thought were interesting to think about and maybe consider adding them to your motion for staff to explore. One of them is, so some of the trees are not evergreen, like the blue oaks that are up there. So now you're going to have a different look during some part of the year versus other part of the year. So one of the things the Planning Commission talked about quite a bit was, well, what time of year do you do this analysis? Do you force them to do it at the worst time of year? And, well, you don't really want to do that. But maybe you can assign some percentage, so this goes to a second part of it. If a tree is got a big canopy but is very see-through because it's not very healthy, do you consider that 100% or do you give it some percentage? And then maybe do you reduce that percentage if it's, say, a blue oak that's not going to have any leaves part of the year? So I'd see if you want to add something like that to your motion for staff to explore.
Okay, so considering that as a request for an amendment to the motion, I would politely and respectfully decline, because I would want staff to come back with what I say is a kind of a screening language on how that works. I'm hesitant to say it has to be X time of year and Y time of year, kind of like a shadow study, because then it's not necessarily fair to the applicant to have it go that far. And it's my understanding that, though I had difficulty believing it, that you couldn't actually do a Google photo in January and a Google photo in June and figure out what the trees are going to look like, but I was told that you couldn't do that. So I'm hesitant to do that, because once you start putting formulas in, people tend to devolve to the formula instead of thinking about the entire picture, so I would rather not do that.
If I could respond.
Mr. Rennie?
So actually, I'm not necessarily, I'm not advocating that we dictate a formula, just maybe that they think about the issue is really what I'm saying.
I'm fine with thinking about the issue. I just don't want to dictate how that happens.
Yeah, because you've asked them to generate something,
Yes.
so think about this as part of it.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Rennie.
Seconder.
Mr. Rennie, anything else that you want to discuss rather than debate directly with Ms. Jensen and vice versa? Okay, Ms. Syak.
Not debating, but just pointing out that in that Planning Commission discussion, they were talking about having it just be as the application comes in, and whatever that screening provided, whether the applicant wanted to apply during the winter where there would be sparse canopy, or whether in the summer they actually wanted to wait and have a full canopy there. One thing that I think we still haven't made clear, whether or not in the area of screening, the trees that are native should be counted versus non-native. And I think as Dr. Weissman said, there was significant discussion on that, and it wasn't immediately in their motion, but what I would ask staff to do is just follow and be consistent with our tree protection ordinance. We spent a significant amount of time on that, and there was a lot of discussion on focusing on the native trees. And so in my mind, even though it was not necessarily in the motion, if you follow the tree protection ordinance, you'll see that significant weight will always be placed on native trees. Okay,
a couple things. Thank you, Ms. Syak. I agree, in listening to the Planning Commission, this timing issue, they, basically, as what I heard them saying is you shouldn't have the applicant, be forced to go out in June rather than December, just let it go naturally. That's what I heard, and I agreed with that. The native versus non-native, I'm going to ask the maker of the motion, is that expressed or implied in part of your motion, or did you feel as though it was not another issue that needed to be addressed?
The only thing I intended to address in my motion was that to the extent that there was a replacement tree or there was consideration of any kind of planting, that it had to be native. But, it's not, that's part of the equation. And I think that Ms. Sayak's suggestion that we follow closely our tree ordinance makes a lot of sense.
All right, then we will include that in your motion, and as a seconder, I will agree with it. Further discussion. Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. There was the speaker from Summerhill Homes who brought up the paint chips, and I don't know if the motion and the seconder, anything was incorporated in regards to that speaker's concerns.
I did not include that, but subject to the seconder, my motion would specifically not adopt the suggestion of the speaker that the roof be included.
I also listened to that discussion at the Planning Commission level also, and I agreed with the conclusion that they reached. And so I would leave that portion of the Planning Commission's decision intact. Further discussion? Okay, then, Ms. Pavetti.
May I have a clarification of the motion? It appears that the motion focuses primarily on the visibility analysis and returning that to staff. Is it the intent of the council to have a separate motion on the color averaging?
I could do that if you want to.
I think it might be helpful for some of the applications that are pending in community development.
All right, we have a motion and a second. No further discussion. All in favor? Aye.
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 Opposed? Passes unanimously. Ms. Jensen, did you have another motion?
Yes, my motion would be to adopt the color analysis reflectivity level as recommended by the Planning Commission, and specifically exclude the suggestion that we include roofs.
Second, discussion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you, council. We're going to take a 10-minute break. I will see you at 10:15. We will go on to the last agenda item. Council, calling this meeting back to order. Staff. We are on agenda item 3.3, PPW jobs regarding annual street repair and resurfacing project and pavement rehabilitation crack seal. Ms. Peterson, will you be making the staff report?
Yes, I will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor and Council members. Lisa Peterson, Town Engineer. Tonight, I'll be talking about the annual street rehabilitation project. In your staff report, you do have background on that project, also the staff report from the 19th. Staff was in front of council on the 19th requesting approval of the project. At that time, council did request some additional information. We believe we have provided that information in the report that you have tonight, and I would like to highlight 3 elements of that information for the council. So the first element I would like to highlight is the importance of our annual street maintenance project and awarding that project every year to prevent our streets from dropping into more costly repair categories. Currently, we do have a pavement condition index in our town of a 67, and that is considered fair condition. So for every year we do not put out our annual street maintenance project, the condition of our town streets will drop 2 to 3 points per year with our pavement condition index. The Street Saver program does tell us that we should try to invest at least $2 million per year in our streets in town in order to keep our pavement condition index at a 67. If we would like to increase that pavement condition index, then we would need to invest more funds into the streets in town. The second element I'd like to talk about is street selection. That was something that came up at the last council meeting that council was interested in hearing about. And what I'd like to do is put up a process flow chart that I have and speak to that. So for our annual street project, we have a process in place that we use, and it is an industry standard. What we do is we do take a very high-level list of streets from Street Saver. In addition to this, we are also looking at a list of streets that we get from our street maintenance division. And typically, these are streets that our maintenance division is concerned is going to drop into a more costly repair category. We take those 2 lists of streets and we go out in the field and we do in-depth field surveys on every one of those streets. Now, in the report, it does go into more detail about how we do that survey, but one of the things that we are trying to do is we're trying to group those streets because we do get a cost benefit of grouping streets. Additionally, we'll look at adjacent streets because, again, if there's one in similar condition, we are going to get a cost benefit by grouping those streets. Finally, we will ultimately develop a cost estimate for those streets, plans, specifications, bring that to council for approval, such as that we're doing tonight. The third element that I wanted to talk about was that this is a new street project. It does have a new scope. Our streets are dynamic. They don't stay in one condition. So a project that I would present tonight would not be the same project as I might present in a year. And streets degrade at different rates. The street project that we're bringing tonight is a street project that we have looked at in 2016. So we've looked at all of those streets in 2016. We've looked at all the elements of those streets, the maintenance that needs to happen on those streets, and it is a good project and for FY 2016, and we're very comfortable with it. And being a new street project, it does have new streets in it. It will have new street sections. It will have new repair quantities in it as well. And it also has a new cost estimate related to it that is based on 2016 cost data. We are here tonight requesting that council authorize us to bid this project and also authorize the town manager to award the project to the low bidder within the budgeted amount of $2.2 million. Thank you very much, and I'm here to answer any questions.
Thank you. I'm going to start with myself. I'm looking at the funding for this project, and so I'm probably looking at the end of your staff report. And I see the funding comes from projects 811-9901 and 811-9903, correct?
That's correct.
Now, were these capital improvement projects that the council approved for the 14-15 and 15-16 capital improvement budgets?
Correct.
So we've already approved the funding. When we approved the funding under those two budget items, did we approve it with associated streets?
You did not.
Okay, so the budget was there for the streets to be determined after the fact?
Correct.
All right, other questions? Mr. Rennie?
Thank you, Mayor Spector. My question was on this methodology. How does this compare to what's used in other towns?
This is typical methodology that is used, and it's typical for if the town were to bring in a pavement consultant to do this work and didn't have town staff to do it. This is industry standard, and it would be something that would be done in line with what a pavement consultant would do.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Seeing none, oops, Ms. Syak.
Okay, so one of the things that I had asked last meeting and that I've gotten clarification on, but I'd like for you to just repeat for me once again, is that the 15 streets that we approved in June, that total to an estimate of $900,000, those 15 streets are still on our new list, today's list, but they are actually larger in scope because you've added more street segments to it. Is that, or street length to it? That's correct. And so that unit length that has increased is adding to the increase in the estimate that you're proposing to us tonight.
That's correct.
Okay. And then the new streets that you've proposed to augment the 15, those were determined based on this system that you're presenting in front of us?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so that's my only question for now. Thanks.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you. If you want to talk to us on this issue, please submit a card. I have one card, Angelia Dorner.
Hello, Angelia Dorner from the Almond Grove. You know that I don't think any resident should have to wait for very long to get their streets repaired, and that is not my goal in asking these questions. I've given you all a comprehensive analysis on this project, and I'm not intending to go through any of those details, but I sure hope you have. It boggles my mind that the same street scoped at $900,000 less than 6 months ago has now been increased in costs by an additional $750,000. That is the same streets, and the majority of that is for work to be done on the same sections that were included before. Before I get into what bothers me the most about our streets, I just have a couple other things to put up right up front. Alberto Way, please, why are we doing Alberto Way and Highway 9 because of this development project? At the last meeting, you were told that the section of Alberto Way next to the development would not be included. It is still included in the bid amounts. My issue is that Highway 9 will be used for all of that construction traffic. That entire intersection is going to have to be totally redone. We're talking 2 years down the road, and all the work that we spend on that area will need to be redone. It will be ruined. Hillside streets. The hillside streets and scopes are still all included in this year's budget. I have no problem with all the being done. However, why do them all in 1 year where we are going to have an inordinate amount of travel-related or traffic-related control costs associated with this year's budget versus spreading that over a longer period of time? In addition, Blackberry Hill, is it private or is it not private? Two different people from two different government agencies have told me that it is a private road. And have we added Cypress Way to this list in order to get up to Blackberry Hill? And by the way, right at the end of where we say we're going to stop on Blackberry Hill, there's this big, beautiful mansion that just is built up there and is currently on the market. The thing that I have the most issues with is our PCIs. Whoops, I'm giving you my notes. That's not going to work. Is our PCIs. These PCIs are absolutely insane. As far as I'm concerned, the Street Saver program is absolutely non-functional. It is supposed to make sense. It is supposed to make analytics. You have these numbers in your packet in the last page. Absolutely makes no sense. Even the example up here, 769. That particular street, 6 months ago, Q&A from staff said that it had a PCI of 71 and was going to get a slurry seal of $2. Now it's down to 49.
Thank you.
None of these make sense. Thank you.
I have several questions.
Okay.
Highway 9 in Alberta, I'm assuming, you probably said that I'm assuming that your concern about that is because of the pending development.
That's correct. The EIR is in the process of being developed, and so I would expect that within 2 years, even with some issues and mitigation ideas there, it's going to be having a tremendous amount of traffic and hopefully money coming from the developer to redo that entire intersection with the traffic flow.
And then with regard to Blackberry, the issue is it private? And with regard to Cypress, is it being used to access Blackberry?
Yeah.
Okay.
Cypress has a PCI of 55, and it continues beyond Blackberry Hill, this area that says private here, up to county. But again, the three hillside streets, we actually have, you mentioned the funding. We actually have $250,000 in a separate fund for hillside street repair and resurfacing work, and it specifically is targeted for Shannon Road. I don't know why that $250,000 isn't being considered in with this project as well.
I'm going to stop you there because you're getting beyond
Okay.
my thinking and my question. And then with regard to Street Saver, you have a concern about their analysis of PCI or the changing numbers. So I will ask this of staff. It's a methodology. It's a methodology that it's apparently used here and other places. Why not use it?
I don't believe in the results that are coming out of Street Saver right now. I mean, literally, if you look at these PCIs, which you have on step 7 out of your little packet that I sent to you all this early this morning, these PCIs came out of Street Saver. Look at these PCIs on the right compared to the cost per square yard, which corresponds to this chart. So you have got up on the left-hand side PCIs, and I have it these are from the streets in this project, okay? 59 at $14. Then you've got something at 44 of $7.10. Shoot over to the right. You've got a whole host of streets that are anywhere between a PCI of 36 and 22, but they're all being done with a rubber cape seal, which is typically about a $7 per square yard cost, when it should be, you would expect, a lot closer to the $70 reconstruction. Something is just totally not making sense. I also used Monjero Court as an example where it dropped in the last 6 months from, I'm just talking PCI from Street Saver, it went from 71, which was listed in the staff report in June, to a 49 that is listed in the staff report today. How did that happen? It happened in Street Saver. My biggest issue is that we have no street management system. We're relying on Street Saver, but obviously the data in Street Saver, or however it is being used, is not giving us information we need to properly manage this town. Deferred management costs
Thank
comes
you.
out of Street Saver.
Other questions? Seeing none? Thank you. I have no other cards, so I will close the public testimony portion of this hearing, and once again look to Mr. Rennie for a question. Or is it a motion or discussion?
I want to start with some questions. So on the PCI question from Ms. Dorner, my understanding, and please explain it if I'm wrong, is you're just using the PCI as a starting point that puts you in the ballpark of which streets to look at. But then your methodology seemed like you then went out and looked at all the streets and made intelligent decisions. And then the second part, I guess maybe a question was her point about why are the costs different. And I didn't look carefully, but I did ask the question that ended up in our desk item of how could we do a rubber cape seal on a PCI of 13, and then your answer came back was you were doing dig out, so it wasn't just rubber cape seal. So I assume the cost went up because it's not just a rubber cape seal. So that's lots of question all at once, I guess. Thank you.
Yes, so correct. The Street Saver program is giving us a very high-level look at the streets. So what we need to do is go out and look at those individual streets to see from our engineering analysis how we feel those streets are going to need to be repaired. With some of these streets that are in poor repair condition, Street Saver just tells us that apparently this is in let's say, a PCI of a 20, which is considered poor condition. Now, when we go out to look at that street, from having many years of pavement experience, we look at the street and we can make a determination on that 20 PCI. Is it a 20 PCI that's going to be requiring a lot of dig outs all on the street? Is it just cracking that is very tight type of cracking? So there's different types of cracking and different types of distresses on the street that can be treated in different types of ways. That's something that Street Saver doesn't know. I mean, Street Saver just says, okay, this street is approximately at this level, it's going to drop over a certain period of time, and it's a very high-level program, so we have to get in there to actually do the analysis to figure out what we can do. And obviously, if we're seeing streets, even if the Street Saver program shows it's a low PCI, but we know that we can get out there and fix it and take care of that street, of course it's something that we would want to do. For example, I think a good example is Shannon, which is showing a PCI of 21 or 22 right now. Now, ultimately, you could say, well, we should go reconstruct that street. Well, we know what kind of costs we're going to be looking at for that. That's probably $5-6 million. The other thing we could say is, hey, we should probably go out and overlay that street. Now we're looking at a cost of probably $1.5 million. Or we can say, let's go out there and do spot repairs. Let's do this leveling course. Let's do dig outs where we need to do. Let's put the rubber cape seal on. We know this works. We've been using it in the town for 10 years. And let's instead pay $300,000, $400,000 for that street. So it's trying to get these streets before they fall into the conditions that are going to be very costly for us.
Thank you. Further, Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Ms. Peterson, Ms. Dorner brought up a number of points. Blackberry Hill Road, is that private?
So this is showing Blackberry Hill Road. This is Blackberry Hill Road right here. This is in the town. So this is the section that we're talking about. This section is in the county, and up past this area is private. So the area that we are doing is in the town.
Okay, so that was the cost reflected in the estimate, was just the town portion and nothing else?
Correct.
Okay. Ms. Dorner also mentioned the costs for the same streets that we reviewed, I think it was last May, have increased by $750,000. What was $900,000 then is now 1.650 or something.
So again, this is a different project that we're talking about. For example, Shannon Road has increased significantly from what we were talking about previously. Previously, we had about 6,000 lineal feet of Shannon, and now we have about 10,000 lineal feet of Shannon. We're also fixing the section of Shannon more towards Hicks in this project, and if anybody has driven that section, you'll know what great disrepair that section is in. So it is going to be requiring a lot of spot repairs.
Mr. Leonaris, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Ms. Dorner also brought up the issue of traffic mitigation in the hillsides, and perhaps we can save money if we stagger it, Kennedy versus Shannon, in different cycles.
Ultimately, what we are trying to do, as I mentioned, is group streets. And, it actually is more cost-effective for us to get in there and try to do Cypress at the same time we're doing Eugenia and Blackberry and this upper section of Cypress, because the contractor is going to get in there and do his traffic control from one end to the other. That's the big cost component in these projects is the traffic control. So if a contractor has an area that is more contained and connected, that's something that they're going to give us a cost break on.
May I continue?
You may.
Regarding the comments about Alberta Way and Highway 9 and the pending project, what would be the urgency of doing those streets now as opposed to waiting until the project is finished?
So here's a section of Alberta Way, and as you can see, the one end section towards Highway 9 we have left off the project because that is where they're going to be doing the new development. The new development will be required to come in and do street maintenance on that section. Ultimately, we do want to include the rest of Alberta, which the construction traffic will not be going down because that road is in significant need of repair. Again, one of the things that I mentioned we're trying to do is catch streets before they drop into the more costly repair categories, such as a reconstruction. So it's important for us to get on them before that.
Two more?
Go ahead.
Ms. Dorner also mentioned a $250,000 fund for hillside streets. Specifically, she mentioned Shannon Road could be repaired with these funds. Is it true that we have that money sitting in a separate account?
That money was already spent. We did do some repairs on Shannon Road with that $250,000. Unfortunately, $250,000 doesn't go very far in these types of spot repairs, but that money has already been utilized.
So there is no $250,000 anymore?
There is no $250,000.
Last question pertained to the Street Mongenera Court. Ms. Dorner brought up the point that the PCI index dropped significantly in the 6 months or 8 months, whatever it's been since. So can you explain that specifically? It seemed like it dropped quite significantly.
Yes, thank you for the question. As I've mentioned to council, we are currently going through a PCI update in the town, and that PCI update is nearly complete. So we do, currently they have been starting to input the new PCI numbers into the Street Saver program over at MTC. So that information is some of the new information that we have out there from our new street survey. Ultimately, we're hoping to get all that information to council within the next month or two.
Just one last follow-up on that.
Mr. Leonaris.
Thank you, Mayor. So basically, the information that was presented last June was not accurate. That was old information. Someone actually had to go out and evaluate the PCI index and then input it into the database. Is that how it works? Or
ultimately, no. What happens, thank you for the question. What happens is every 2 years, our streets are reassessed. Our arterial and collector streets are reassessed. And every 4 years, our residential streets are reassessed. So that happens through a consultant that actually is hired on with money from MTC. And that's, they give us a grant to do that, to hire that consultant on. That will happen along those periods of time, every 2 years, as I mentioned, and every 4 years.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Syak.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Peterson. So I want to go back to the discrepancy in the original bid versus the new bid. And I understand that we're looking at new projects, but if you could just help me understand how these estimates are derived. And so let's use Alberto Way as an example. On the original bid, we have it for Alberto Way from Highway 9 to the end, but we're actually going to do the red part. And so in the plans and specs that you have here that an engineer will bid on, how do they know that it's just going to be the red portion versus Highway 9 to the end?
The way that a contractor would bid on this is they would look at the quantity. We provide them with the map for information. We provide them with limits for information. But what they're looking at is the quantity.
And if I may just so the quantity then is the linear feet square, and tell me if I'm saying everything wrong, but basically how much street will actually be repaired.
Correct.
And so the numbers that we have from the old to the new, the increase, for example, in Shannon, you've increased it based on what? Based on having more funds to be able to repair more street, or based on your visual inspection that you need more potholes repaired? Can you just walk me through how you increase the scope of the same street that we looked at in June?
And Shannon is a good example, because Shannon, last June, we actually had wanted to do the entire section of Shannon to Hicks Road. We discovered that we weren't going to have enough funds in order to do Shannon, so we cut Shannon back on what we had wanted to do. Now we do have the new funding, fiscal year 15-16 funding, so it did allow us to put that back in the project.
And then the last question. So we award, should it be approved tonight, we award the plans and specs, and we say, go ahead, go get bids. We choose the lowest bid, and then at that time again, is there someone that goes out and actually quantifies how much street, how much, potholes, how many, is there another measurement of how much actual work will be done and how much we will end up paying for?
Yes, so what happens is we assign our engineering inspector to the project, who's actually been part of the process of coming up with these quantities to begin with. What they do is they go out and they mark the streets for the contractor, show them exactly where they want them to do this work, and ultimately we only pay for what gets done. So that's why we have it by the unit price. If they do less, they get less money. If we have to increase it a little bit, they get a little bit more money, but it's all by the unit price.
Go ahead.
And who is verifying what that unit price is?
The unit price is set. Once it's bid, once the project gets bid, the unit price is set.
So if the unit price is set, it's the actual quantity then, and that is verified again?
Correct. That's verified by our town inspection staff.
Okay. And in your experience, in the many projects you've done, how often does that fluctuate?
It always fluctuates a little bit, but
down, both?
It does both, yeah, it does both, because one of the things to keep in mind is, as we go through the El Nino winter, you're going to see a change again in the streets, and some of those areas will probably increase. So it does change with time and weather.
So if I'm a contractor and I bid on 300 square feet of a road to be repaired, and I come in and I realize, only 200 needs to be done, what's the incentive for me as a contractor to report I've only done 200 if I've been allocated a certain amount?
Every day we have an inspector that's on the job, watches everything that they're doing, what they're putting down, and measures it with the contractor. They don't get paid until that's all measured at the end of the day with the contractor, and ultimately get paid once a month based on those quantities that are measured.
All right, anybody else? let me just follow up because the information that staff is giving us and the information that Ms. Dorner's given us certainly gives me new eyes when I look at these reports. So I'm going to go back to just a little thing, which is the one in Alberta Way. It's still not making any sense to me because I heard Ms. Sayak say it's Highway 9 to the end, but you're saying it's little part in the center. So there's a disconnect for me.
So the section of Alberta that we will do will basically be doing, and correct me if I'm not answering what you asked, but our goal is to do all of Alberta Way except the section in front of the proposed development. And so we have quantities in the plans that reflect that.
And maybe this is where I'm having my disconnect. Is there a document that says you're going to be doing Highway 9 to the end?
So that is part of our project, is to also do Highway 9 from Caltrans limit to Los Gatos Boulevard. That's a different section of road that we are doing. Did you want me to put that up? I could.
Yeah, why don't you, please? Mr. Rennie has just pointed out that you may have misunderstood my question, or I may not have articulated it for you. But I'm using Alberta Way as an example of trying to understand. And you're saying that we're doing a limited portion of Alberta Way, and we're doing a limited portion because we're not going to do the portion in front of the development, so we're not going to go all the way to Highway 9.
Correct.
But I think there's a document that says you're going to do the whole thing from Highway 9 to the end. Is that something I am misunderstanding?
So ultimately, let me look at our list.
Madam Mayor,
So
if I may.
Okay, so on our list, we do say from Highway 9 to end. And again, what the contractor will do, he's just going to look at the quantity, and then he's going to say, okay, what do you want me to do on the street? And we go out with our construction engineering staff. They're going to mark, okay, we want you to go from here to here, and that's what the contractor's going to do.
And again, I'm still using this as a learning opportunity. Why put Highway 9 to the end on this list, Exhibit 5, if you're not going to do it?
This is to give a general idea of what we're going to do, because there's not a specific street right there where we're ending. It would be, harder to make a description. Again, the contractor, they're not going to look at this, and they're not going to bid off this. All they're going to be looking at is the total quantity that's on that particular street.
Thank you. Other questions? All right. Discussion, motion. Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Obviously, this is our second pass at this, and it's getting a little more clear, but it's still slightly unclear to me. I was wondering if if this were to go back one more time, would it put us at a competitive bidding disadvantage if it came back next meeting after perhaps some further clarification? And I don't necessarily have any specifics, but there are still some uncertainties that I have.
So I think Matt Morley, Director of Parks and Public Works, we're at the time of year now where every month that we delay, we're losing traction because other organizations are bidding it. The work is getting taken up and prices are going up. So it is a critical point. But I think we're more interested in addressing the questions that you might have. So specific, for instance, to Alberta Way or to how we bid the streets. If there's clarifications that you need that we can make that make you comfortable, that's where we need to be, and that's our interest. I would like to reiterate a little bit on the bidding. We use the streets in the list as an identifier for the contractor to get them in the right area and so that they can make a judgment on streets that are in the same local area for things like traffic control and mobilization that are costs that they have that we by grouping streets can control, as Ms. Peterson had said. Ultimately, it's a unit cost contract, so they provide us unit costs. We provide them the number of units ahead of time, and then we cross-check those units during construction as they're applying the material. So on Alberto Way, we will go out there ahead of time. We will paint with paint in the street, and you see this periodically in the streets where there's boxes marked in the streets. Those are the areas where we want the contractor to do some work. That's work that we tell them to do ahead of time. We walk the job with the contractor, measure those areas so that we're both have the same understanding of what work is going to be done, and then that's the unit that we pay for. It's verified again as the work is done. That's why we have an inspector on site for the course of the project, so that we have complete accuracy on the quantities that are being applied to the street. The price that we pay the contractor is the quantity price times the fixed amount that they've bid. They've given us a competitive bid amount, fixed unit cost, square yard cost. We multiply that by the number of square yards. That's what we pay them. If they bid if we told them ahead of time that there was going to be 80,000 square yards and they put down 70,000 square yards, that's all they get paid for is the 70,000. They don't get paid for more, and that's verified by town staff on a routine and regular basis.
Mr. Leonardis?
So from this point forward, what happens next is you do as you just discussed, walk through the contractors who are interested. They prepare bids, they submit bids, the bids come, they get all opened up, they're sealed, they get opened up on the front counter. We choose the lowest bid. Does council then get to see that information and vote at that point in time? So it's coming back to us one more time.
So we have not been bringing the awards back. We can do that, but there is no discretion at that point. On a public works bid, it goes to the low bid. So the council has no discretion to choose the second lowest or the third lowest bid because maybe that's a better reputable contractor. That's not the way a public works bid proceeds. You're obligated to either reject all bids or to award to the lowest cost bid.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Rennie?
Mayor Spector, I think that we've looked at their process, and it seems like a very robust process, and it looks to me like they're following it. We've beat on this quite a bit. I feel comfortable that the project is good the way it is, so I'd like to make a motion that we go ahead and approve the project as they have planned. They call it revised plans, but the plans that are here for the annual street repair and resurfacing and pavement rehabilitation crack seal project, and authorize the town to advertise the project for bid, authorize the town manager to award and execute a construction agreement in amount not to exceed the available budget amount of $2,232,782, which includes a 15% contingency.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. I'm going to support the motion at this point. And I think what would make these kinds of decisions easier for me in the future is for staff to be aware and sensitive that the specs of the work are going to be examined maybe more carefully by the council than they have in the past. And when somebody says, we're going to do X amount of Shannon or X amount of Alberta Way, and then that's really not what is going to be done, that's going to lead to questions, it's going to lead to concerns about overpayment, and it'll slow the project down. So what I will be looking for in the future, because you raised the issue, is detail that is specific to the project. Further discussion. Ms. Sayak?
I am going to support the motion, and because I want to use this as a learning opportunity for all of us, as the mayor said, those are things that we would be looking for in future reports. I think what would be helpful for personally me is to follow this as a case study through. So when we do get the bids through a manager's memo, just share who it is that we are awarding it to, with what amount, and as it just moves through the process, I think it might actually be helpful if we have examples of, okay, our engineer has gone out and this is what we verified. This is such an unknown area that this actual, having a case study so that we can actually visualize what happens with such large amounts would be quite helpful, so that on an annual basis, we're not constantly questioning, well, what happens next? And we kind of understand the process that you're living on a day-to-day basis.
We can go one step further. If anybody's interested in actually going out and seeing these projects in process, where we're paving or while we're marking them, we're happy to take you out and show you what
Like
what
a
we're doing.
ride-along.
Absolutely.
Okay. Do I get a hard hat?
Sure, and a vest.
All right, so with regard to, Ms. Sayak, with regard to this case study, you're talking about this specific project.
Correct, and not necessarily, I don't need to know all 15 streets, but Shannon seems to be one, Alberto, those were questions we constantly had on those streets. It would be good to occasionally have examples of what's happening next.
We'll do some of that, and we'll do some pictures, and again, the ride-alongs are...
I think that would be helpful.
All right, so you understand what's being asked of you, okay? And Ms. Pravetti, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
All right. Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector, and piggytailing off of what the Vice Mayor said, for me, I'm always concerned about the money. So, for instance, it's 2,232. If somebody comes in and they bid it for $1.7 million and change, and they're the lowest bidder, and then they go out there and they actually do the work, and we find that the quantities are less, and the final total is $1.5 million and change. It would be interesting to see those numbers, how those progress. I realize we are working with estimates here, and those are difficult. And there has been many questions brought forth by the community about that, so that would be helpful in this particular case study to me to see what the final results were.
Thank you, Mr. Leonardis. And back to staff, is that understandable and is it doable?
That's clear and doable.
Okay, and what are we talking about for this case study? Year?
Construction timeline through the summer, so we would probably report back to you in August, September when the project's complete with a final accounting and the dollar perspective, but along the way you should see some progress reports from us as well.
All right, thank you. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you, everybody. Job well done. Meeting adjourned.